In the whispered spaces between what was and what might have been, entire worlds have slipped through the fingers of time like sand through an hourglass. Cities that once thrummed with the heartbeat of humanity now lie buried beneath layers of earth and centuries, their stories told only by the wind that moves through their forgotten stones. These are the civilizations that time has chosen to erase from common memory, leaving behind only fragments and shadows, clay tablets speaking in tongues we barely remember, stone foundations of palaces where no kings now walk, and the eternal silence of streets that once echoed with the laughter of children who knew nothing of the darkness that would eventually claim their world. Tonight, we descend into these buried realms, where the past breathes softly in the darkness, waiting for those brave enough to listen to its ancient songs. If this journey into history gently moves you, take a second to like, share, and subscribe. It helps more sleepy minds find their way here, by the way. Where in the world are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment before you drift off. We read every single one, long before the pyramids cast their shadows across Egyptian sands, before the first Olympic flame was kindled in ancient Greece, and before Rome's eagles soared across continents. There existed civilizations so advanced, so perfectly organized, that their sudden disappearance remains one of history's greatest mysteries. These were not primitive settlements clinging to survival, but sophisticated urban centers where engineers designed drainage systems that would impress modern city planners, where artists created works of beauty that still captivate archaeologists today, and where ordinary people lived lives of remarkable comfort and order. The Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan Civilization, flourished between 3300 and 1300 BCE across what is now Pakistan and northwest India. For over 2 millennia, these people built cities that were marvels of urban planning, with populations that may have reached 5 million at their peak. Yet they vanished so completely that their existence was unknown to the modern world until the 1920s, when British archaeologists began uncovering the carefully laid bricks of their forgotten Metropolis. Picture, if you will, the great city of Harappa in its prime around 2600 BCE. The morning sun rises over walls of precisely cut stone, casting long shadows down streets that run in perfect grids, as straight and true as any modern city planner might devise. The sound of water flows through covered drains beneath the streets, an engineering feat that many cities wouldn't achieve for thousands of years to come. In courtyards, artisans work copper and bronze with skills that speak of generations of accumulated knowledge, while in workshops, craftsmen create pottery decorated with patterns so intricate they seem to dance in the flickering light of oil lamps. The people of this civilization possessed a written script that decorates their seals and pottery. Yet, despite decades of scholarly effort, their language remains unread, their stories untold in their own words. They left behind thousands of inscribed seals, each one a potential key to their thoughts and beliefs, yet the code remains unbroken. Imagine the chronicles we have lost, the love poems, the administrative records, the religious texts, the personal letters between friends separated by the vast distances of their trading networks. All of it remains locked away behind symbols we recognize but cannot comprehend. These were not an isolated people. Archaeological evidence reveals that the Harappans maintained trade relationships spanning from Central Asia to Gujarat, from Afghanistan to coastal India. Their standardized weights and measures suggest a level of commercial sophistication that unified their vast territory under common practices. merchants from Harappa walked the same trade routes that would later become legendary, carrying goods along paths that would eventually see the caravans of the Silk Road in the bustling markets of Dalavira. One of their greatest cities, vendors, would have sold goods that came from impossible distances for the ancient world. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, jade from Central Asia, shells from the Arabian Sea, and metals from regions hundreds of miles away. The very existence of these goods in Harappan cities tells us of a network of relationships and trust that spanned continents, of travelers who braved dangerous journeys through unknown territories, carrying not just goods but stories, languages, and ideas. The people themselves seem to have lived in a remarkably egalitarian society. Unlike the grand palaces and massive monuments of their contemporaries in Egypt and Mesopotamia, Harappan cities show little evidence of extreme wealth inequality. The houses, while varying in size, suggest a large middle class of prosperous citizens rather than a society divided between royalty and peasants. Even their art reflects this: no grand statues of kings, no monuments to divine rulers, but rather graceful figurines of dancers, careful studies of animals, and intricate geometric patterns that speak of a people who found beauty in harmony and proportion rather than in displays of power. Their cities were marvels of practical engineering. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro, lined with perfectly fitted bricks and sealed with natural tar, speaks of ritual importance and engineering skill combined. The sophisticated drainage systems that served every house suggest a people deeply concerned with public health and sanitation. Wide streets allowed for easy movement of goods and people, while smaller lanes provided access to residential areas that seemed designed for community life rather than defense. But something went wrong in this carefully ordered world. Around 1900 BCE, the great cities began to decline. The causes remain debated: perhaps climate change that dried up the great rivers, perhaps invasion by people with different ways of life, perhaps internal social upheaval, or perhaps a combination of all these factors. The script suggests economic stress in its later phases, with shorter inscriptions and simpler seals. The careful urban planning begins to break down, with houses built on former streets and drainage systems falling into disrepair. By 1300 BCE, the great experiment of the Harappan civilization had ended. The cities were gradually abandoned, their inhabitants dispersing to smaller settlements, or perhaps integrating with other cultures. The knowledge of writing disappeared, the standardized weights and measures were forgotten, and the techniques for making their distinctive pottery were lost. The very memory of these great cities faded until they became legends, then myths, then nothing at all. Winds began to blow dust over the empty streets where children had once played games whose rules we'll never know. Rain filled the abandoned wells where communities had gathered to draw water and share news. Plants pushed up through the gaps in pavements that had been laid with mathematical precision. The great granaries that had stored surplus grain for lean years fell silent, their contents long since consumed or scattered to feed the birds and rats that inherited the empty buildings. For 3,000 years, the cities of the Indus Valley lay buried beneath accumulating earth and time, their stories sleeping beneath the surface of the world. Farmers plowed fields above buried palaces, children played games in the dust of kings, and the seasonal floods of great rivers washed over the remains of a civilization that had once channeled those same waters with perfect skill. While the Indus Valley civilization was reaching its peak, far to the west, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, other forgotten cities were writing their own chapters in the book of vanished worlds. Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization, gave birth to urban centers whose names echo through time like half-remembered dreams. Ur, Uruk, Babylon, Nineveh, Mari, and dozens of others that rose and fell like waves upon an eternal shore. Many people know of Babylon and its hanging gardens, of Nineveh and its great library, but between these famous names lie the remains of cities that were just as magnificent in their time, just as crucial to the development of human civilization, yet have faded from popular memory like morning mist. The city of Mari, for instance, once controlled vast trading networks along the Euphrates River and left behind an archive of over 25,000 cuneiform tablets that revealed the intimate details of Bronze Age diplomacy, trade, and daily life. Picture the Great Palace of Mari around 1800 BCE, its 300 rooms spread across 6 acres. Its walls decorated with murals depicting scenes of investiture and triumph. The king Zimrilim ruled from here, maintaining correspondence with rulers as far away as Anatolia and Egypt. His letters reveal a world of complex international relations, where marriage alliances sealed peace treaties, where merchants required royal protection for their caravans, and where spies and diplomats moved like shadows between the great powers of the age. In the palace archives, scribes recorded everything: the amount of oil required to light the palace lamps, the gifts exchanged between rulers, the complaints of merchants whose goods had been seized by bandits, the reports of governors from distant provinces. These tablets give us an unusually intimate glimpse into the workings of an ancient state, revealing that the concerns of Bronze Age administrators were remarkably similar to those of their modern counterparts: managing resources, maintaining infrastructure, dealing with corruption, and trying to keep the peace between competing interests. The women of Maris royal court emerge from these archives as real people, rather than the shadowy figures that queens often become in ancient records. Queen Shibta wrote letters to her husband, the king, discussing political matters with intelligence and authority. Princess Kerma managed vast estates and conducted business negotiations. The letters between royal women reveal networks of communication and influence that spanned the ancient Near East, with queens and princesses serving as essential diplomatic links between kingdoms. Even further north, in what is now central Turkey, lay the ancient trading center of Kanish, known to its inhabitants as Nessia. This city was the heart of an Assyrian merchant network that connected Mesopotamia with Anatolia from about 1950 to 1750 BCE. The Assyrian merchants of Kanish left behind the largest collection of private correspondence from the ancient world, over 23,000 cuneiform tablets found in their houses and shops. These tablets reveal a world of international commerce that was remarkably sophisticated. Merchants formed partnerships, established branch offices in distant cities, used written contracts for complex deals, and even had systems for letters of credit that allowed them to transfer money across vast distances without actually moving silver or gold. A merchant in Ashur could write a letter instructing his agent in Karnish to pay a debt to a business partner in Kultupai, and the financial instruments existed to make this possible. The letters also reveal the human side of ancient commerce. Merchants complained about dishonest business partners, worried about their health in foreign climates, and sent affectionate messages to family members back home. A merchant named Puzarashur wrote to his wife, "Year after year you keep sending me the same complaint. You have not sent me silver, and your friends' wives are wearing fine jewelry while I go without. Now, I am sending you by this caravan a beautiful garment and silver for jewelry. please don't keep writing these complaints to me. The international character of Kanish is evident in its ruins. Houses built in the Assyrian style stood next to buildings constructed according to local Anatolian traditions. The archives contain letters written in Assyrian, Hittite, and other languages, revealing a cosmopolitan environment where different cultures lived and worked together. The local rulers welcomed the foreign merchants, taxing their trade but also protecting their interests, creating one of history's earliest examples of a multicultural commercial center. Women played important roles in this trading world. Some were merchants in their own right, conducting business across international borders. Others managed the home offices while their husbands traveled to distant markets. The wife of a merchant named Kulia wrote to him, "The silver you sent was of poor quality and was rejected at the market. I have sold our wool at a good price instead and am investing the proceeds in copper, which I hear is in demand where you are now trading." In northern Syria, the ancient city of Ebla controlled one of the most powerful kingdoms of the 3rd millennium BCE. Yet its very existence was unknown to historians until the 1960s when Italian archaeologists began excavating the tell that contained its remains. The discovery of Ebla's archives in 1975 revolutionized our understanding of Bronze Age Syria and revealed a forgotten empire that had influenced the entire ancient Near East. At its height around 2500 BCE, Ebla was the center of a kingdom that stretched from the Euphrates River to the Mediterranean Sea. The city's archives, containing over 17,000 cuneiform tablets, reveal a sophisticated state administration that managed tribute from dozens of smaller cities, maintained diplomatic relations with distant powers, and controlled trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with Egypt and Anatolia. The people of Ebla spoke a previously unknown Semitic language that scholars call Ebla. Their tablets record not just administrative matters but also literary works, including the earliest known creation myths and epic poems outside of Mesopotamia. Some of these stories contain elements that parallel later biblical narratives, suggesting cultural connections that persisted for millennia, even after Ebla itself was forgotten. The economic records from Ebla paint a picture of extraordinary wealth and complexity. The kingdom controlled the production and trade of textiles, precious metals, and luxury goods. Royal workshops produced elaborate garments dyed with expensive purple dye extracted from murex shells gathered along the Mediterranean coast. Craftsmen, working with gold and silver, created jewelry and decorative objects that were traded as far away as Egypt and Afghanistan. The city's prosperity attracted people from across the known world. The population included Sumerians, Akkadians, Hurrians, and others, creating a cosmopolitan environment where different languages, religions, and customs mingled. The royal court employed foreign advisors and specialists, while the merchant quarters housed traders from distant lands, who brought exotic goods and new ideas to the city's markets. But Ebla's golden age was not to last. Around 2300 BCE, the city was destroyed by Sargon of Akkad, the first ruler to create a true empire in Mesopotamia. The palace was burned, the archives scattered, and the kingdom dismantled, though the city was later rebuilt and remained important for several more centuries. It never again achieved the wealth and influence of its early period. Far from the river valleys of Mesopotamia and the Indus, in what is now the heart of the Sahara Desert, archaeologists have discovered the remains of sophisticated urban centers that flourished when the region enjoyed a much wetter climate. The Garamantian civilization, centered in the Fezzan Basin of Libya, created in complex society that lasted for over 1,000 years. From about 500 BCE to 700 CE, the Garamantians were master engineers who created one of the most impressive irrigation systems in the ancient world. Using a technique called phgora, they dug underground channels that brought water from aquifers in highland areas to their cities and agricultural fields in the lowlands. These underground aqueducts, some stretching for over 100 kilometers, required remarkable engineering skill and represented a massive investment of labor over many generations. Their capital city of Kerma was a cosmopolitan center that connected sub-Saharan Africa with the Mediterranean world. Archaeologists have found evidence of trade goods from across Africa and beyond: glass beads from India, silk from China, wine amphorae from the Roman world, and gold and ivory from regions far to the south. The city's cemeteries reveal a society with complex social hierarchies, where elite burials contained elaborate grave goods, while commoner graves were simpler but still showed evidence of prosperity. The Garamantians left behind thousands of rock art sites scattered across their territory, creating one of the world's largest concentrations of prehistoric art. These paintings and engravings depict a landscape very different from today's desert one, filled with rivers, lakes, and abundant wildlife. Elephants, giraffes, hippopotamuses, and crocodiles appear frequently in their art, alongside scenes of cattle herding and chariot warfare that reveal important aspects of their culture and way of life. Their society was highly militarized, with horse-drawn chariots playing a central role in both warfare and ceremonial life. The famous rock art of the Sahara includes hundreds of depictions of these vehicles, showing their evolution from heavy, ox-drawn carts to light, fast chariots pulled by horses. The Garamantians may have been among the first people in Africa to master the use of the horse in warfare, giving them a significant military advantage over their neighbors. Women held important positions in Garamantian society, as evidenced by rich female burials and artistic depictions showing women in positions of authority. Some graves contain weapons and horse gear associated with female skeletons, suggesting that women may have participated in warfare or held military command. Rock art scenes show women participating in ceremonial activities and religious rituals, indicating their important role in the spiritual life of the community. The gradual drying of the Sahara eventually brought an end to Garamantian civilization. As the climate became more arid, the underground water sources that fed their irrigation systems began to fail. The once fertile valleys turned to sand, the rivers dried up, and the abundant wildlife disappeared. The population gradually dispersed, some moving north toward the Mediterranean, others south toward the Sudan, leaving behind only the silent ruins of their cities and the magnificent rock art that still decorates the desert landscape today. Travelers crossing the Sahara can still see the remains of Garamantian settlements, mounds marking ancient cities, scattered pottery fragments glinting in the sand, and the carefully engineered stone structures that once controlled their water supply. But perhaps most haunting are the phgora themselves, the underground channels that represent such an enormous investment of human labor and ingenuity. Many still contain water, flowing silently through darkness beneath a landscape that has become one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. Meanwhile, far across the Indian Ocean, another forgotten civilization was reaching its own peak of achievement. The people of the Maldives Islands, long before they became known primarily as a modern tourist destination, had developed one of the most sophisticated maritime cultures in the ancient world. For over 1,000 years, from roughly 1100 to 1900 CE, they maintained trading relationships that spanned the entire Indian Ocean, connecting the markets of India and Southeast Asia with those of the Persian Gulf and East Africa. The Maldives were master shipbuilders and navigators who could read the subtle signs of wind, current, and weather that allowed them to travel vast distances across open ocean without instruments. Their distinctive donny boats, with their characteristic curved prows designed to cut efficiently through ocean swells, became a common sight in ports from Calicut to Muscat to Malacca. These vessels, constructed entirely without metal fastenings, using traditional coconut palm wood and coir rope, were ideally suited to the monsoon winds and shifting seas of the Indian Ocean. The foundation of Maldivian prosperity was their control of several crucial trade goods. Chief among these was cowrie shells, small mollusks that were harvested from the reefs around the islands and exported to serve as currency in many parts of Africa and Asia. For centuries, Maldivian cowries were legal tender in regions as distant as Bengal and the Niger River Valley, making the tiny island nation one of the world's most important sources of international currency. They also exported coir rope made from coconut fiber, which was highly prized by shipbuilders throughout the Indian Ocean region for its strength and resistance to salt water. Dried fish, particularly tuna, prepared using traditional smoking and curing techniques, formed another important export. The Maldivians developed sophisticated methods for preserving fish that allowed their products to remain edible during long sea voyages, making them essential suppliers for the maritime trade. Networks of the region dot the islands served as crucial way stations for merchants traveling between India and the Middle East. Maldivian ports provided fresh water, food, and repairs for ships, making the long journey across the Arabian Sea. The strategic location of the islands, combined with the maritime expertise of their inhabitants, made them indispensable partners for traders from many different cultures and kingdoms. But the Maldivians were more than just middlemen in other people's trade networks. They developed their own unique culture that blended influences from India, the Arab world, and Southeast Asia, while maintaining distinctive characteristics. Their language Devahi evolved from ancient Sanskrit but incorporated vocabulary from Arabic, Tamil, and other languages, reflecting their cosmopolitan connections. Their architecture showed similar cultural fusion, with mosques built using coral stone and featuring decorative elements that combined Islamic geometric patterns with local artistic traditions, the most remarkable achievements of Maldivian civilization were their coral stone mosques and the sophisticated society that created them. The islands are built entirely of coral, and the inhabitants learned to quarry and work this material with extraordinary skill. The Hukuru Miski Mosque in Mali, built in Ilu Wuba, represents the pinnacle of this art form, with its intricate geometric patterns carved directly into coral blocks and assembled without the use of mortar. These mosques were not just religious centers but also served as community gathering places, schools, and repositories of learning. The Maldivians developed their own distinctive script called Thera, which was used to record religious texts, historical chronicles, and works of poetry. Local scholars maintained extensive libraries and carried on scholarly correspondence with learned men in India, Arabia, and other centers of Islamic learning. The social organization of the Maldives was remarkably egalitarian compared to many other societies of the period. While there were hereditary ruling families, the small size of the islands and the maritime nature of the economy meant that most people had opportunities for advancement through trade or seamanship. Women held important positions in society. with some islands being ruled by female sultanas, and women regularly participating in trade and maritime activities. The environmental knowledge of the Maldivians was extraordinarily sophisticated. Living on low-lying coral atolls with limited fresh water and soil, they developed sustainable practices that allowed their society to flourish for centuries, without degrading their fragile ecosystem. They understood the complex relationships between coral reefs, fish populations, and ocean currents, and managed their marine resources with care that ensured long-term sustainability. Traditional Maldivian navigation techniques were passed down through generations of master navigators who could find their way across hundreds of miles of open ocean using only their knowledge of stars, currents, wind patterns, and the behavior of seabirds. These navigators were respected figures in their communities, often holding hereditary positions and special privileges in recognition of their crucial skills. The decline of traditional Maldivian civilization began in the colonial period, as European powers established control over Indian Ocean trade routes and introduced new technologies that made traditional navigation and shipbuilding techniques obsolete. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 shifted major trade routes away from the southern Indian Ocean, reducing the strategic importance of the Maldives. The introduction of modern currencies undermined the cowrie shell trade that had been central to the island's economy for centuries. By the early 20th century, the sophisticated maritime culture that had made the Maldives a crucial link in Indian Ocean trade networks had largely disappeared, replaced by a more isolated and subsistence-oriented way of life. The knowledge of traditional navigation, shipbuilding, and marine resource management gradually faded as the economic incentives for maintaining these skills disappeared. Today, visitors to the Maldives can still see remnants of this forgotten civilization in the coral stone mosques that dot the islands, in the traditional dhoni boats that have been adapted for modern tourism, and in the place names and cultural practices that preserve memories of the island's cosmopolitan past. But the full extent of Maldivian achievement in creating a sustainable maritime civilization is only now being recognized by historians and archaeologists, working to reconstruct the networks of trade and culture that once connected the islands to the wider world. As the gentle waves of the Indian Ocean continue to wash against the coral shores of these ancient islands, they carry with them the whispered memories of centuries when these tiny specks of land were crucial nodes in a vast network of maritime trade and cultural exchange. The monsoon winds that once filled the sails of Maldivian donnis now blow over resorts and airports. But beneath the modern surface lies the sediment of a remarkable civilization that mastered the art of living in harmony with the sea. And so, our journey through the first forgotten realms draws to a close, though the path ahead still stretches into depths of time where other lost worlds await our discovery. We have walked the planned streets of Harappa, read the business letters of Assyrian merchants, marveled at the rock art of Saharan civilizations, and sailed the trade routes of Indian Ocean navigators. Each of these societies developed unique solutions to the challenges of their environments, created distinctive cultures that enriched human civilization, and then faded into the gentle darkness of forgotten time. The wind continues to blow through empty doorways where families once gathered for evening meals. Rain still falls on abandoned courtyards where children once played ancient games. And the eternal cycles of seasons continue to turn over landscapes that once supported thriving communities. But in the quiet moments when we listen carefully to the whispers of the past, We can still hear the echoes of their voices calling across the centuries, reminding us that all civilizations, no matter how powerful or sophisticated, are temporary. Expressions of human creativity and adaptability in the face of an ever-changing world. The earth beneath their feet, where countless generations had walked before them, carrying within their hearts the same yearning for permanence that would echo across millennia in civilizations yet unborn. Far to the west, where the Mediterranean stretched like a sapphire blanket beneath endless skies, another civilization was writing its own chapter in humanity's grand story. On the island of Crete, where myth and reality danced together in eternal embrace, the Minoans were crafting a world unlike any other that had come before. The palace of Knossos rose from the earth like a dream made manifest, its corridors winding through chambers painted with scenes of impossible beauty. Here, in these labyrinthine halls, lived a people who understood that civilization was not merely about conquest or control, but about the celebration of life itself. The walls spoke in colors that time would struggle to fade, deep blues of the sea that surrounded them, vibrant reds of the earth that nurtured them, and golds that captured the light of the sun that blessed their island home. In the courtyards of Knossos, young men and women performed the sacred bull-leaping ritual, their bodies arcing through the air with a grace that defied gravity itself. This was not mere sport or entertainment, but a communion with forces far greater than themselves. The bull, symbol of power and fertility, became their partner in a dance that spoke of humanity's eternal desire to transcend its earthly limitations. Spectators watched in breathless silence as these athletes transformed themselves into living poetry, their movements scripting stories of courage and faith across the arena's sandy floor. The Minoan cities were unlike any that had risen before them. Where other civilizations built walls to keep enemies out, the Minoans built harbors to welcome the world in. Their ships, sleek and purposeful, cut through Mediterranean waters carrying not just goods but ideas, art and dreams. Traders from distant lands walked through Minoan markets where pottery gleamed like captured starlight and textiles, whispered stories of hands that had woven them with love and skill passed down through generations. In the workshops of Knossos, artisans practiced their crafts with a devotion that bordered on the sacred. The potter's wheel spun like a prayer wheel, each vessel emerging as a meditation on form and function. The delicate faience figurines they created, the famous snake goddesses, with their mysterious smiles and elaborate dress, seemed to hold secrets about the relationship between human and divine that would baffle archaeologists thousands of years later. These were not mere decorations but doorways to understanding, a worldview where the sacred permeated every aspect of daily life. Women held a place in Minoan society that would not be seen again in Europe for millennia to come. They appeared in frescoes as equals to men, participating in religious ceremonies, governing households, and contributing to the complex web of relationships that held their civilization together. The great goddess who watched over their island was depicted not as a distant, stern deity, but as a nurturing presence whose power flowed through every aspect of their world. From the fertility of their fields to the abundance of their seas, the linear, a script that the Minoans used, remains one of history's most tantalizing puzzles. These marks, etched into clay tablets and carved into stone, carry the voices of people who lived over 3,000 years ago, yet their language remains stubbornly silent to modern ears. Perhaps this silence is fitting, for it allows us to imagine the conversations that once filled the halls of Knossos merchants, haggling over the price of purple dye, priests discussing the meaning of dreams, children learning the steps of ancient dancers, lovers whispering promises beneath Cretan moons. But even in their golden age, the Minoans carried within their civilization the seeds of its own transformation. The volcanic island of Thera, which lay like a jewel in the water's north of Crete, began to stir with subterranean restlessness. The earth itself, which had nurtured their civilization for so many centuries, was preparing to reshape their world in ways they could never have imagined. When Thera finally erupted, it did so with a violence that shook the very foundations of their island paradise. The explosion sent tsunamis racing across the Mediterranean, and ash clouds darkened skies from Egypt to Anatolia. The immediate destruction was devastating, but perhaps more profound was the psychological impact on a people who had lived in harmony with their natural world for so long. The earth had betrayed them, or so it might have seemed to those who survived to witness their beautiful palaces buried beneath layers of volcanic debris. Yet, the Minoans' greatest legacy was not in the stones they laid or the ships they sailed, but in the proof they offered that human civilization could flourish without the constant threat of war. For nearly 1,000 years, they had demonstrated that prosperity could be built on trade rather than conquest, that art could be valued as highly as armor, and that the greatest strength a society could possess was not the ability to destroy its enemies, but the wisdom to avoid making enemies in the first place. While the Minoans danced with their bulls beneath Mediterranean skies, far to the north and east, in the rugged highlands of Anatolia, another great civilization was forging its destiny with iron and fire. The Hittites burst onto the stage of history like thunder rolling across mountain peaks, their chariots carrying them from their highland strongholds to the very gates of Babylon and the borders of Egypt itself. In the capital city of Hattusa, carved from the living rock of the Anatolian plateau, the Hittite kings ruled an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Here, in halls where the echoes of ancient councils still seemed to whisper through the ruins, diplomats and generals planned campaigns that would reshape the political landscape of the ancient world. The city itself was a marvel of engineering and ambition, its massive walls following the natural contours of the landscape as if the earth itself had chosen to protect this center of power. The Hittites understood something that many of their contemporaries did not, that true strength lay not just in the ability to conquer, but in the wisdom to govern. Their legal code, preserved on countless clay tablets, reveals a society that struggled with the same questions of justice and morality that continue to challenge us today. How should a king balance the demands of warfare with the needs of his people? What obligations do the powerful owe to the powerless? These tablets, buried for millennia beneath the ruins of Hattusa, carry the voices of judges and lawmakers who sought to create order in a chaotic world. In the royal workshops of Hattusa, smiths worked with a metal that would change the world forever. Iron, once rarer than gold, became the Hittites' secret weapon, literally and figuratively. They were among the first to master the complex art of ironworking, turning this stubborn metal into tools and weapons that gave them a decisive advantage over their bronze-wielding enemies. The secret of their success lay not just in the technology itself, but in their willingness to embrace change and innovation when others clung to tradition. But the Hittites were not merely warriors and metal workers. In the quiet chambers of their temples, priests and scribes preserved a literary tradition that included some of the world's oldest epic poetry. The tales they told of gods battling primordial monsters, of heroes facing impossible odds, of love and betrayal among both mortals and immortals, influenced storytelling traditions for centuries to come. Their myth of the storm god's battle against the dragon Yanka echoed the eternal human struggle against the forces of chaos and destruction. The Hittite military machine was a wonder of organization and innovation. Their war chariots, drawn by swift horses trained on the steppes of central Anatolia, could strike with devastating speed and then withdraw before enemies could respond. But more than mere military might, the Hittites developed a sophisticated understanding of diplomacy and international law. They were among the first to sign formal peace treaties, documents that laid out precise terms for ending conflicts and establishing stable relationships between nations. The most famous of these treaties was signed with their great rival, Egypt. After decades of warfare that had exhausted both empires, the Battle of Kadesh, fought on the banks of the Orontes River, had demonstrated that neither nation could decisively defeat the other. From this recognition of mutual strength and mutual limitation came a peace that would endure for generations, allowing both civilizations to focus their energies on creation rather than destruction. In the archives of Hattusa, thousands of cuneiform tablets preserve the diplomatic correspondence of the Hittite kings with their contemporaries across the ancient world. These letters reveal a complex web of relationships, alliances, and rivalries, trade agreements and territorial disputes, royal marriages and diplomatic protests. Reading them today is like eavesdropping on conversations between the rulers of great powers, their words carrying across the centuries with surprising immediacy and relevance. The Hittite royal family maintained relationships with the courts of Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon through an intricate system of gift exchange and royal marriages. Princes and princesses traveled hundreds of miles to marry into foreign dynasties, carrying with them not just dowries of gold and precious objects, but the hopes and fears of their peoples. These marriages were more than political arrangements. They were bridges between worlds, creating bonds that could survive even when armies clashed on distant battlefields. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Hittite civilization was its religious tolerance. In an age when most peoples believed their gods were the only true deities, the Hittites welcomed foreign gods into their pantheon with an openness that would be remarkable in any era. Their great rock sanctuary at Yatzolakaya depicts dozens of deities from across their empire, carved into the living stone as eternal witnesses to their inclusive vision of the divine dot. As centuries passed, however, the very success of the Hittite Empire contained within it the seeds of eventual decline. The vast territories they controlled became increasingly difficult to govern from distant Hattusa. Local governors began to act more like independent rulers than loyal servants of the king. The iron technology that had once given them such advantage began to spread to their enemies, leveling the playing field in ways that would ultimately favor smaller, more agile neighbors. The final blow came not from any single enemy, but from a combination of pressures that even the mighty Hittite military machine could not withstand. Climate change brought drought to their agricultural heartland. The mysterious sea peoples, migrants and raiders whose origins remain debated by scholars, began pressing against their western borders. Internal rebellions weakened their control over distant provinces. Like a great tree that had grown too tall for its roots, the Hittite Empire began to sway and crack under pressures from all directions. As the Hittite Empire crumbled into memory and myth, far to the west, in the rolling hills of central Italy, another mysterious civilization was beginning to flourish. The Etruscans emerged from the mists of prehistory like figures from a half-remembered dream, bringing with them customs and beliefs that would profoundly influence the course of Roman history and, through Rome, the entire Western world. In the hilltop cities of Etruria vie Tarquinia, Volcae, and Seveteria, people developed who seemed to live with one foot in this world and one in the next. Their tomb paintings, preserved in underground chambers carved from volcanic rock, reveal a civilization that celebrated life with an intensity born from their profound awareness of death's inevitability. These frescoes dance with color and movement, banqueters raising cups in eternal toasts, musicians playing instruments whose melodies we can almost hear, athletes competing in games that honor both gods and ancestors. The Etruscan language remains one of archaeology's greatest puzzles. Its words preserved on thousands of inscriptions, yet stubbornly resistant to complete understanding. We can read many individual words and phrases, but the deeper meaning of their longer texts continues to elude us, as if the Etruscans deliberately crafted their language to guard their secrets from future ages. Perhaps this linguistic mystery is fitting for a people who seem to understand that some truths are too profound for ordinary words to contain. What we do know about the Etruscans comes largely from their elaborate burial practices and the extraordinary objects they chose to accompany their dead into the afterlife. Their tombs were not mere repositories for corpses, but entire houses for the deceased, complete with furniture, jewelry, weapons, and artwork. The famous Tomb of the Reliefs at Cerveteri recreates an entire domestic environment in carved stone cooking. Utensils hang from hooks, weapons rest in their proper places, and even household pets are memorialized in eternal stone. Etruscan women enjoyed a social status that scandalized their Greek and Roman neighbors. They participated freely in banquets alongside men, owned property in their own right, and were buried with inscriptions that proudly proclaimed their achievements and lineages. The famous sarcophagus of the spouses from Cerveteri shows a married couple reclining together in death as they had in life, their expressions serene and loving, their hands touching in a gesture of eternal companionship that speaks across the centuries of the bonds that unite human hearts. In the workshops of Etruscan cities, artisans created objects of breathtaking beauty and technical sophistication. Their bronze work was unrivaled in the ancient world. The famous chimera of Arezzo, with its snarling lion's head, goat's body sprouting from its back, and serpentine tail, captures in metal the complex mythology that shaped their worldview. Their terracotta sculptures, from the Apollo of Vi to countless smaller figurines, demonstrate a mastery of form and expression that would influence Roman art for centuries to come. The Etruscans were master engineers whose innovations would become fundamental to Roman civilization. They developed the arch as a structural element, built sophisticated drainage systems that turned swampland into fertile fields, and created road networks that connected their cities with remarkable efficiency. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer system, was originally an Etruscan engineering project that demonstrated their understanding of public health and urban planning. Religion permeated every aspect of Etruscan life in ways that went far beyond the ritual observances common to other ancient peoples. They believed that the will of the gods could be read in the flight patterns of birds, the appearance of lightning, and especially in the examination of sacrificial animals' organs. Their priests, called Heraspices, developed elaborate systems for interpreting these divine messages, creating what was essentially a science of supernatural communication that Roman generals would consult before every major battle. The Etruscan understanding of time itself was circular rather than linear. They believed that history moved in great cycles, and that by understanding the patterns of the past, it was possible to predict the future. Their sacred books, written on linen and referenced by Roman authors, but now lost to us, supposedly contained prophecies about the rise and fall of civilizations, including predictions about their own eventual absorption into the growing Roman state. Trade was the lifeblood of Etruscan civilization, their merchant ships sailing to every corner of the Mediterranean and beyond. They established trading posts along the coasts of France and Spain, brought amber from the Baltic, silk from distant Asia, and ivory from Africa. Their cities became cosmopolitan centers where Greeks, Phoenicians, Celts, and peoples from across the known world mingled in markets that buzzed with the languages and customs of a dozen different cultures. The wealth generated by this trade allowed the Etruscans to live with a luxury that amazed their contemporaries. Their banquet halls were filled with imported delicacies, their bodies adorned with jewelry crafted from precious metals, their homes decorated with artwork that demonstrated their sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities. Yet this material prosperity was always balanced by their deep awareness of life's transience, a philosophical perspective that gave their culture its distinctive character as Rome grew in power and ambition. The relationship between the two peoples became increasingly complex and ultimately tragic. Many of Rome's most important institutions, the fasces, symbols of authority, the triumph ceremony for victorious generals, gladiatorial games, and even the toga were borrowed from Etruscan tradition. Rome's last three kings were Etruscan, and their influence on early Roman law, religion, and culture was profound and lasting. Yet the very qualities that made Etruscan civilization so distinctive, their individualism, their loose, confederated political structure, their emphasis on enjoyment of life rather than military conquest, ultimately made them vulnerable to Roman expansion. Where Rome developed iron discipline and unified command structures, the Etruscans remained a collection of independent city-states, whose cooperation was often voluntary and temporary. The final conquest of the Etruscan cities was not accomplished through single dramatic battles, but through a grinding process of siege, negotiation, alliance, and absorption that lasted for centuries. Some cities fought to the bitter end, their walls breached only after months or years of Roman pressure. Others opened their gates willingly, their leaders calculating that cooperation offered better prospects than resistance. A few managed to maintain nominal independence well into the imperial period, their ancient customs gradually fading away like morning mist before the rising sun of Roman uniformity. But the Etruscans' greatest legacy was not in the objects they created or the cities they built, but in their demonstration that human civilization could flourish through different values than those that dominated their age. In a world increasingly defined by military might and political conquest, they showed that a society could prosper through trade, artistry, and a deep respect for the mysterious forces that govern human destiny. Their tomb paintings continue to smile across the centuries, reminding us that there are as many ways to live meaningfully as there are human hearts to imagine them. As we drift through these chambers of memory, where Etruscan voices still whisper their secrets in languages we struggle to understand, we begin to sense the vast tapestry of human experience that continues to unfold across time. Each civilization we have encountered, the pragmatic Indus Valley dwellers, the ambitious Mesopotamians, the sea-loving Minoans, the iron-forged Hittites, and the enigmatic Etruscans, has added its own thread to this eternal weaving, its own note to the symphony of human endeavor that plays on even now, in our own time, in our own hearts, as we too struggle to create meaning and beauty in a world that offers no guarantees, except the certainty of change itself, the knowledge of iron, working, spreading like wildfire across the ancient world. Yet even as this new age dawned, there were those who had mastered both the old ways and the new, creating civilizations that would bridge the worlds of bronze and iron, of tradition and innovation, of the familiar and the utterly extraordinary. Far up the Nile, where the river carved its ancient path through lands of gold and granite, there arose kingdoms that would challenge the very notion of what it meant to rule in the ancient world. Here, in the region the Greeks would call Nubia and the Egyptians knew as Kush, civilizations flourished that were older than Rome, richer than many empires, and more mysterious than the legends that would eventually be all that remained of that glory. That the land itself seemed touched by the divine. Golden sands stretched endlessly beneath a sky so blue it appeared painted by the gods themselves. The Nile, that great mother of civilizations, flowed northward here with a different character than in Egypt, wilder, more unpredictable, dotted with cataracts that sang ancient songs as they tumbled over granite shelves worn smooth by millennia of passage. Along these banks, where acacias cast their delicate shadows and date palms swayed in the desert wind, cities rose that would become the stuff of legend. The kingdom of Kush emerged from the mists of prehistory like a dream half remembered. Upon waking, its origins lay deep in the African interior, where oral traditions spoke of migrations and settlements, of chiefs who became kings and villages that grew into cities. By the time Egyptian records began to mention these southern neighbors, Kush had already been thriving for centuries, its people mastering the arts of agriculture, pottery, and metallurgy, with a skill that impressed even the proud pharaohs of the north. Kerma, the first great capital of Kush, rose beside the Nile like a jewel set in the desert's crown. Its walls, built of mud brick but reinforced with a sophistication that spoke of advanced engineering, enclosed a city unlike any other in the ancient world. The central temple, known today as the Western Defufa, stood as a massive rectangular structure that dominated the skyline, its walls rising 40 feet into the desert air. This was no mere building but a statement of power, a declaration that here dwelt a people who could move mountains if they chose. Within the city's walls, life pulsed with a rhythm all its own. Craftsmen worked in their workshops, creating pottery so fine it rivaled the best of Egypt, fashioning jewelry from gold that seemed to flow like liquid sunlight in their skilled hands. The markets buzzed with languages from across the known world, Nubian dialects mixing with Egyptian, Ethiopian tongues blending with the speech of traders from lands so distant their very names were legend. Ivory from the deep interior passed through these markets, alongside ebony wood so dark it seemed to absorb light, leopard skins that spoke of hunts in jungles no northerner had ever seen, and always, everywhere, gold. The gold of Nubia was legendary even in an age when legends walked the earth. It came from mines worked by techniques passed down through generations, from streams where children could pan nuggets with their bare hands, from veins that ran through the mountains like the very blood of the earth. This was the gold that would adorn pharaohs, that would fund armies and build monuments, that would make Nubia a prize coveted by every empire that ever cast its eyes southward along the Nile. But Kerma was more than a trading post, more than a collection of wealthy merchants and skilled craftsmen. It was the heart of a kingdom that stretched far into the African interior, a realm that controlled trade routes reaching to the Red Sea and beyond. The kings of Kerma ruled from palaces that archaeologists have only begun to understand, buildings whose foundations still whisper stories of feasts and councils, of alliances forged and enemies defeated, of a power that was both ancient and innovative. The burial customs of Kerma revealed the true depth of this civilization's achievement. When a king died, he was not buried alone, but accompanied by hundreds of retainers, all dressed in their finest garments, all bearing the tools and treasures of their trades. These were not sacrifices in the brutal sense known to some cultures, but rather voluntary companions for the journey to the afterlife. Individuals who chose to follow their lord into the realm of the ancestors. The tombs themselves were marvels of engineering, great circular mounds that rose like artificial hills above the desert floor, their interiors holding chambers filled with grave goods that spoke of wealth beyond imagination. As centuries passed, the relationship between Kush and Egypt became a complex dance of cooperation and conflict, of cultural exchange and territorial ambition. Sometimes the Nubians served as mercenaries in Egyptian armies, their skills as archers earning them fame throughout the ancient world. The Egyptian name for Nubia, Tasseti, meant land of the bow, a testament to their prowess with this weapon. Sometimes they traded peacefully, Egyptian goods flowing south, while Nubian gold flowed north. And sometimes they warred, the desert echoing with the clash of armies and the cries of the dying. It was during one of these periods of conflict that Egypt conquered Kerma, incorporating Nubia into its empire and seemingly ending the independence of the southern kingdom. For centuries, Nubia existed under Egyptian rule, its people serving as administrators and soldiers, its gold flowing north to fund the pharaoh's ambitions. Many believed that the proud kingdom of Kush had been extinguished forever, reduced to nothing more than a province of its northern neighbor. They were wrong. Like a river that flows underground only to emerge stronger than before, Nubian power was merely gathering itself for a resurgence that would shake the ancient world. As Egypt weakened during the tumultuous years of the late period, as the pharaoh struggled with internal strife and foreign invasion, the Nubians began to remember who they had been. In the south, far from the chaos of the north, a new kingdom was taking shape, one that would not merely rival Egypt, but would conquer it. This new realm centered itself at Napata, a city that rose near the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal. Here, where a pinnacle of sandstone rose like a finger pointing toward the heavens, the Nubians built temples that rivaled those of Karnak and Luxor. The mountain itself was believed to be the dwelling place of Amun, the great god who was revered both in Egypt and in Nubia, and the temples built in its shadow reflected this divine connection. These were not mere copies of Egyptian architecture, but something new, a fusion of northern and southern traditions that created buildings of startling beauty and power. The kings who ruled from Napata called themselves pharaohs, not from any sense of inferiority, but from a genuine belief that they were the rightful heirs to the traditions of the Nile. They saw themselves as the true guardians of Marat, the Egyptian concept of cosmic order and justice, believing that they alone maintained the proper relationship between the earthly and divine realms. Their temples were filled with hieroglyphic inscriptions that proclaimed their devotion to the ancient gods, their commitment to the old ways, their role as protectors of sacred tradition. Under kings with names like Kashta and Pi, this Nubian Renaissance gained momentum. They conquered territory after territory, moving northward along the Nile with armies that combined traditional Nubian archery with Egyptian military techniques and equipment. But their conquests were not mere military adventures. They were crusades of cultural restoration, attempts to return Egypt to what they saw as its proper spiritual and political order. When Pi finally completed the conquest of Egypt around 747 BCE, establishing what historians would call the 25th dynasty, he was not content merely to rule. He demanded that his victory be recorded in stone, and the stela that bears his name tells a story that reads like an epic poem. Here was a conqueror who wept when he saw the suffering of his enemies, who demanded that prisoners be treated with dignity, who saw his victory not as a triumph of force, but as a restoration of divine order. The inscription describes how he purified himself before entering Memphis, how he performed the proper rituals before the gods, how he treated the conquered Egyptians not as subjects but as fellow children of the Nile. For nearly a century, Nubian pharaohs ruled Egypt, their black granite statues standing alongside those of their predecessors in the great temples of the north. They built ostensibly, restoring monuments that had fallen into disrepair, commissioning new temples and pyramids, maintaining the ancient traditions with a devotion that put many native Egyptian rulers to shame. Their art showed a distinctive style that blended Egyptian canonical forms with Nubian aesthetic sensibilities, creating sculptures and paintings that were both familiar and startlingly new. These Nubian pharaohs were more than competent rulers. They were remarkable individuals whose personalities shine through the formal inscriptions and official art of their reigns. Taharqa, perhaps the most famous of the dynasty, ruled for 26 years with a combination of military prowess and cultural patronage that made him a figure of legend. He campaigned in Palestine and Syria, built extensively throughout both Egypt and Nubia, and maintained trade networks that reached from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa. When the Assyrians finally drove him from Egypt, he returned to Nubia not as a defeated exile, but as a king returning to his true home. But even as the Nubian pharaohs were forced to abandon Egypt to Assyrian conquest, their kingdom in the south continued to flourish. The capital shifted from Napata to Meroe, a city that would become even more magnificent than its predecessor, located between the 5th and 6th cataracts of the Nile. In a region blessed with iron ore and good agricultural land, Meroe became the center of a civilization that would endure for another 1,000 years, long after Egypt itself had fallen to Persian, Greek, and Roman conquerors. Meroe was a city like no other in the ancient world. Its location made it a natural crossroads for trade between the Mediterranean world and the African interior, between the Red Sea ports and the Nile Valley. Caravans arrived daily bearing goods from India and China, from Ethiopia and the lands beyond the Great Desert. The markets of Meroe sold silk and spices, precious stones and exotic animals, iron tools and golden ornaments, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that rivaled Alexandria or Antioch. The city itself reflected this international character, Egyptian style. Temples stood alongside buildings that showed Indian and Persian influences. The royal palace complex included audience halls decorated with frescoes that depicted not only traditional Egyptian and Nubian motifs, but also elephants and lions, giraffes and ostriches, images that spoke of a kingdom that extended far into the African heartland. The famous pyramids of Meroe, smaller and steeper than their Egyptian counterparts, rose like a forest of stone monuments, each one marking the burial place of a king or queen who had ruled this remarkable realm. For the kingdom of Meroe was notable, not only for its wealth and its strategic position, but also for the prominent role played by women in its governance. Queens ruled in their own right, not merely as regents for absent or underage kings, but as sovereign monarchs whose authority was absolute. These were not the passive, secluded figures that characterized royal women in many ancient societies, but active, powerful rulers who led armies into battle, conducted diplomatic negotiations, and sponsored great building projects. Queen Amanirenas, who ruled in the 1st century BCE, exemplified this tradition of female power. When the Roman Empire, fresh from its conquest of Egypt, attempted to extend its control southward into Nubia, she met them with an army that fought with the fury of lions defending their cubs. For years, she and her forces battled the legions of Augustus, Caesar himself, conducting a guerrilla campaign that utilized the difficult terrain of the cataracts and the desert to neutralize Roman advantages in equipment and training. The conflict ended not with Nubian defeat, but with a negotiated peace that recognized Meroitic independence and established a frontier that would endure for centuries. The wealth that supported these military adventures and building projects came not only from gold and trade, but also from an innovation that set Meroe apart from almost every other ancient civilization. They were among the first peoples in Africa to master the production of iron on an industrial scale. The city became a center of metallurgy, so important that modern archaeologists have called it the Birmingham of ancient Africa. The sound of hammers rang day and night from workshops where skilled smiths created everything from agricultural tools to weapons of war, from household implements to artistic masterpieces. This mastery of ironworking was more than a technological achievement. It was a revolution that transformed the entire region. Iron tools made agriculture more productive, allowing farmers to clear more land and cultivate it more effectively. Iron weapons gave Meroitic armies advantages over enemies still relying on bronze or stone implements. Iron goods became major export items, traded throughout the Red Sea region and the Mediterranean world, bringing wealth that funded the kingdom's magnificent monuments and its extensive trade networks. The script used in Meroe represented another remarkable achievement of this civilization. While they continued to use Egyptian hieroglyphs for religious and ceremonial purposes, they also developed their own alphabetic script called Meroitic, which was far simpler to learn and use than the complex hieroglyphic system. This democratization of literacy had profound effects on Meroitic society, allowing more people to participate in government and trade, to maintain records and correspondence, to preserve their own stories and traditions in written form. Unfortunately, the Meroitic script remains one of history's great puzzles. While scholars can read individual words and understand the structure of the language, the full meaning of many Meroitic texts continues to elude translation. The inscriptions on temples and tombs, the royal decrees and private letters, all remain, partly shrouded in mystery, their secrets waiting for some future breakthrough in linguistic archaeology. These texts represent voices from the past that we can hear but cannot fully understand. Stories that tantalize us with their closeness and frustrate us with their continued silence. What we can understand from the material remains of Meroe speaks of a civilization that achieved a remarkable synthesis of African and Mediterranean cultures. The art of Meroe shows Egyptian influences blended with distinctly African elements, creating a visual language that was entirely unique. The reliefs on temple walls depicted pharaohs with clearly African features, performing traditional Egyptian rituals, queens wearing crowns that combined Egyptian and Nubian elements, gods and goddesses whose iconography drew from traditions spanning the entire continent. Religion in Meroe reflected this same synthesis. Traditional Egyptian deities like Ammon and Isis were worshipped alongside gods that seemed to have originated in the African interior. The lion god, Apedmark, depicted with the body of a man and the head of a lion, became particularly important in Meroitic religion, perhaps reflecting the kingdom's connections to regions where lions were still common. Temples dedicated to this uniquely Meroitic deity rose throughout the kingdom. their walls decorated with scenes of royal worship and divine protection. The decline of Meroe, when it finally came, was gradual rather than sudden. The rise of Aksum in Ethiopia provided competition for the Red Sea trade routes that had been crucial to Meroitic prosperity. Climate change made agriculture more difficult in the traditional heartland. The Roman Empire's shifting priorities reduced demand for some traditional Meroitic exports. Gradually, over the course of several centuries, the great city began to shrink, its population dispersing to smaller settlements, its monuments falling into disrepair. By the 4th century CE, Meroe had been largely abandoned, its last kings ruling over a much reduced realm from smaller capitals. The final blow came with the conquest by the kingdom of Aksum, whose king Azana left an inscription boasting of his victory over the Nubians. But this was not the end of Nubian civilization. Rather, it was a transformation. The people of Meroe dispersed throughout the Nile Valley and beyond, carrying their skills and traditions with them, contributing to the rich cultural mixture that characterized post-classical Africa. Today, the ruins of Kerma, Napata, and Meroe stand silent in the Sudanese desert, their broken walls and weathered pyramids bearing witness to civilizations that once rivaled Egypt and Rome. The wind that blows across these sites carries with it the whispers of a past that was far more complex and sophisticated than most people realize. A reminder that the ancient world was not dominated only by the familiar names of Greece and Rome, but also by kingdoms whose very existence challenges our assumptions about the past. Half a world away from the golden kingdoms of Nubia, in the steaming jungles of ancient Mexico, another civilization was rising that would prove equally mysterious and equally influential. Here, where the Gulf of Mexico meets the tropical lowlands of what is now Veracruz and Tabasco, the Olmec people created the first great civilization of Mesoamerica, laying foundations that would support all the cultures that followed, from the Maya to the Aztec. The landscape itself seemed designed for mystery. Dense tropical forests stretched to the horizon, broken only by rivers that wound their way toward the sea like silver serpents. Massive ceiba trees, sacred to the peoples of this region, towered above the canopy, their massive trunks serving as pillars in a green cathedral where howler monkeys called and jaguars prowled. Swamps and wetlands provided rich fishing grounds, but also harbored dangers that kept the unwary at bay. This was a land where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural seemed particularly thin, where every shadow might hide a spirit and every sound might carry a message from the gods. Into this challenging environment came people whose origins remain shrouded in the mists of prehistory. They appeared in the archaeological record around 1600 BCE, already possessing sophisticated knowledge of agriculture, pottery, and sculpture that suggests a long period of development in locations we have yet to discover. These early Olmec brought with them ideas and technologies that would transform not only their own region but eventually influence cultures across thousands of miles of the American continents. The first great Olmec center arose at San Lorenzo, a site that modern archaeologists have revealed to be one of the most impressive urban achievements of the ancient Americas. Built on a plateau overlooking the surrounding wetlands, San Lorenzo was both a practical and symbolic statement of human mastery over the environment. The city's planners didn't simply adapt to the landscape. They reshaped it, moving millions of tons of earth to create the elevated platform on which their ceremonial centers and elite residences stood. What made San Lorenzo truly remarkable, however, was not its impressive earthworks, but the massive stone sculptures that marked it as the creation of a civilization unlike any other in the Americas. These were the famous Olmec colossal heads, 17 massive basalt sculptures that even today inspire awe and wonder in those who encounter them. Each head stood between 5 and 11 feet tall and weighed as much as 40 tons. Carved from basalt quarried in the Tuxtla Mountains more than 60 miles away. The logistics of quarrying, transporting, and carving these monumental sculptures speaks to an organizational capability and artistic vision that was truly extraordinary. For its time, the faces depicted in these colossal heads were unmistakably individual, each one different from the others in facial features, headdress design, and overall expression. These were not generic representations of gods or mythical figures, but portraits of specific individuals, almost certainly rulers or other important figures in Olmec society. The artistic skill displayed in these sculptures was remarkable, showing an understanding of human anatomy and proportion that would not be equaled in Mesoamerica for centuries to come. But perhaps most intriguing of all was what these heads revealed about Olmec society and its connections to the wider world. The facial features depicted were clearly those of the indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica, yet they showed a sophistication in artistic conception that seemed to emerge fully formed, without the gradual development usually associated with early artistic traditions. Some scholars have suggested that the Olmec artistic style showed influences from other parts of the world, though the mechanisms by which such influences might have reached the Gulf Coast of Mexico remain deeply mysterious. The religious and ceremonial life of San Lorenzo centered around massive architectural complexes that revealed the Olmec as master engineers as well as artists. The site included elaborate drainage systems carved from basalt, artificial ponds, and pools that may have served ritual purposes, and carefully planned plaza areas where thousands of people could gather for ceremonies and festivals. The entire site was oriented according to astronomical principles that demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of celestial movements and their religious significance. At the heart of Olmec religious practice lay concepts that would become fundamental to all later Mesoamerican civilizations. They developed a complex calendar system that tracked both solar and ritual cycles, creating a framework for understanding time that influenced cultures across the region for millennia. Their pantheon included deities that would be recognized in later Maya and Aztec traditions, particularly the feathered serpent that would become known as Kukulkan to the Maya and Quetzalcoatl to the Aztec. The Olmec also pioneered the ball game that would become central to Mesoamerican culture. Archaeological evidence from San Lorenzo includes what may be the earliest ball court in the Americas, a carefully constructed playing field where teams competed in a sport that was part athletics, part ritual, and part cosmic drama. The game, played with a solid rubber ball that could weigh several pounds, required extraordinary skill and endurance from its participants, who had to keep the ball in play using only their hips, shoulders, and arms. This ball game was far more than entertainment. It was a religious ritual that reenacted the movements of celestial bodies and the eternal struggle between order and chaos. The ball court itself represented the underworld, while the movement of the ball symbolized the journey of the sun through the sky and the underworld. Players were not merely athletes, but ritual performers, whose actions maintained the cosmic balance upon which the survival of the world depended. The influence of San Lorenzo extended far beyond its immediate region, through trade networks that reached across Mesoamerica and beyond. Olmec traders carried not only goods but also ideas, artistic styles, and religious concepts to distant lands. Olmec-style artifacts have been found as far north as central Mexico and as far south as Honduras and El Salvador, evidence of cultural contacts that spanned the entire region. These trade networks were based on the Olmec control of valuable resources, particularly jade and obsidian. Jade, the green stone that was more precious than gold to Mesoamerican peoples, was carved by Olmec artisans into exquisite ceremonial objects that combined artistic beauty with religious symbolism. Obsidian, the volcanic glass that could be worked into blades sharper than modern steel, was shaped into tools and weapons that were essential for both practical and ritual purposes. Around 900 BCE, San Lorenzo experienced a catastrophic destruction. That remains one of archaeology's great mysteries. The massive stone sculptures were deliberately damaged and buried. The ceremonial buildings were demolished, and the site was largely abandoned. Whether this destruction was the result of internal revolution, external conquest, or natural disaster remains unknown. But its thoroughness suggests a deliberate and systematic dismantling of Olmec power at this location. The center of Olmec civilization then shifted to La Venta, a site located on an island in the wetlands of Tabasco. Here, the Olmec created their most impressive architectural achievement, a massive pyramid complex that dominated the landscape and served as the focal point for religious and political activities. The Great Pyramid of La Venta, built entirely of clay and earth, rose more than 100 feet above the surrounding swamps. Its stepped sides carefully planned according to architectural principles that would influence pyramid building throughout. Oamerica. La Venta represented the height of Olmec artistic and intellectual achievement. The site included elaborate mosaic pavements created from hundreds of carefully cut jade blocks, arranged in patterns that may have represented jaguar faces or other religious symbols. These mosaics were then covered with clay and hidden from view, suggesting that their creation was more important than their display, that the act of making them was itself a form of religious devotion. The art of La Venta showed increasing sophistication and complexity, with sculptures that combined human and animal features in ways that suggested transformation and spiritual power. The famous altar depicts a figure emerging from what appears to be a cave or portal, holding a rope that connects to similar figures carved on the sides of the monument. This piece, like many Olmec artworks, seems to tell a story about supernatural journeys and divine encounters, though the specific meaning remains tantalizingly obscure. Perhaps most remarkably, La Venta has yielded evidence of what may be the earliest writing system in the Americas. Stone monuments bear carved symbols that appear to represent concepts rather than simple decorative motifs. Though the full nature of this early script remains hotly debated among scholars, if these symbols do represent true writing, they would predate the earliest Maya hieroglyphs by centuries and establish the Olmec as the inventors of literacy in the New World. The society that created these remarkable achievements was clearly highly stratified, with a ruling elite that commanded the labor of thousands and the skills of master craftsmen. Olmec rulers, depicted in art as wearing elaborate costumes and headdresses, seem to have claimed divine authority, presenting themselves as intermediaries between the human and supernatural worlds. They surrounded themselves with luxury goods imported from across Mesoamerica and sponsored artistic projects that required enormous investments of time and resources. Yet, for all their power and sophistication, the Olmec rulers seem to have governed through religious authority rather than military force. Olmec art contains few depictions of warfare or conquest, instead emphasizing themes of transformation, spiritual journey, and cosmic harmony. This suggests a society where power was legitimized through religious knowledge and ritual performance, rather than through the ability to wage war and dominate enemies. The decline of La Venta, like that of San Lorenzo before it, was sudden and dramatic. Around 400 BCE, the site was abandoned, its monuments defaced or buried, its population dispersed to unknown destinations. Unlike San Lorenzo, however, the destruction at La Venta appears to have been more gradual, possibly representing the slow decline of Olmec power, rather than a sudden, catastrophic event. The legacy of the Olmec, however, far outlasted their political power. Every major Mesoamerican civilization that followed drew upon Olmec innovations and traditions. The Maya inherited Olmec concepts of time and calendar keeping, developing them into the most sophisticated chronological system created in the pre-Columbian Americas. The Zapotic adopted Olmec artistic styles and religious symbolism, adapting them to their own cultural needs. The peoples of central Mexico, including the eventual Aztec, traced their most important religious concepts back to Olmec origins. Most importantly, the Olmec established the fundamental principles of Mesoamerican civilization: the integration of astronomy and religion, the use of monumental architecture to express political and spiritual power, the development of complex trade networks that connected distant regions, and the creation of artistic styles that could communicate sophisticated religious and philosophical concepts. These principles would guide Mesoamerican development for more than 2,000 years, influencing cultures from the deserts of northern Mexico to the rainforests of Central America today. The jungle has reclaimed most Olmec sites, and the great pyramids and plazas lie hidden beneath centuries of vegetative growth. But occasionally, farmers working their fields uncover fragments of jade, pieces of carved stone, or other artifacts that remind us of the remarkable civilization that once flourished in these tropical lowlands. These discoveries continue to reveal new aspects of Olmec achievement and to deepen the mysteries that surround this foundational culture of the Americas. The colossal heads, now displayed in museums throughout Mexico, continue to gaze out with expressions that seem both serene and enigmatic, as if their creators knew secrets about the nature of power and authority that we are only beginning to understand. In their silent presence, we can sense the weight of a civilization that emerged from the jungle to create the foundation upon which all later American achievements would rest, then vanished back into the green embrace of the forest, leaving behind only stones and stories to mark their passage through time. In the highlands of what is now Zimbabwe, where granite hills rise like sleeping giants from the African savannah, there stands a ruin that has puzzled and amazed visitors for more than a century. Great Zimbabwe, whose very name means stone houses, in the local Shona language, represents one of the most remarkable architectural achievements in sub-Saharan Africa, a testament to a civilization that reached heights of sophistication and power that many believed impossible until archaeological evidence proved them wrong. The landscape that cradled this great city was one of dramatic beauty and strategic importance. Rolling hills covered with miambo, woodlands stretched to every horizon, broken by granite kopjes that rose like natural fortresses from the surrounding countryside. Rivers wound through valleys rich with gold-bearing sands, while the grasslands supported vast herds of cattle that represented wealth beyond measure to the pastoral peoples of the region. This was a land where the harmony of human settlement with natural grandeur created something approaching perfection. The story of Great Zimbabwe begins not with the famous stone ruins that give the site its fame, but with humbler beginnings in the early centuries of the first millennium CE. Small farming communities had settled in the region, attracted by the fertile soils and reliable rainfall that made agriculture productive and predictable. These early inhabitants were part of the Great Bantu expansion that had carried ironworking peoples and their languages across much of sub-Saharan Africa, establishing communities that would form the foundation for later developments. What transformed this pleasant but unremarkable region into something extraordinary was the gradual development of trade connections that linked the African interior to the wider Indian Ocean world. Arab and Persian merchants, following monsoon winds and ocean currents, had established trading posts along the East African coast, creating a network of commercial connections that stretched from the Red Sea to the Strait of Malacca. These traders sought gold, ivory, and other African products, offering in return goods from India, China, and the Middle East. The people of the Zimbabwe plateau found themselves perfectly positioned to take advantage of these new opportunities. The rivers that flowed through their territory carried gold that could be panned from the sands or mined from quartz veins in the granite hills. The elephant herds that roamed the region provided ivory of exceptional quality. Most importantly, the inhabitants possessed the organizational skills and political structures necessary to control and develop these resources on a large scale. By the 11th century CE, a settlement at Great Zimbabwe had begun to take on the characteristics that would make it famous. The site was chosen with extraordinary care, taking advantage of natural defensive features while positioning itself to control trade. Routes leading both east toward the coast and south toward other gold-producing regions. A series of granite hills provided natural fortification, while the valley between them offered space for a substantial settlement and the agricultural activities necessary to support it. The early buildings at Great Zimbabwe were constructed of pole and mud, traditional materials that served the community's needs adequately, but left little trace for modern archaeologists to discover. It was only as the settlement grew in importance and wealth that its inhabitants began the massive construction projects that would make their city one of the wonders of the medieval world. The decision to build in stone was not made from necessity suitable. Timber was abundant in the region, but from choice, a deliberate statement of permanence and power that would echo through the centuries. The stone used in Great Zimbabwe's construction came from the granite hills that surrounded the site, but it was not quarried in the conventional sense. Instead, the builders took advantage of the natural weathering processes that had created massive slabs of granite separated by erosion and temperature changes. These natural blocks, some weighing several tons, were carefully shaped and fitted together using techniques that demonstrated both mathematical sophistication and engineering skill of the highest order. The most famous structure at Great Zimbabwe is the Great Enclosure, a massive elliptical wall that encloses an area of nearly an acre. This wall, built without mortar using carefully fitted granite blocks, rises to a height of 36 feet and extends for more than 800 feet around its perimeter. The craftsmanship displayed in its construction is remarkable, with each stone carefully shaped to fit precisely with its neighbors, creating a structure of extraordinary stability and beauty. But the Great Enclosure was more than merely impressive. It was a sophisticated architectural statement that served multiple purposes simultaneously. Its design incorporated both practical and symbolic elements, providing security and privacy for the elite families who lived within its walls while also serving as a powerful symbol of authority and prestige. The wall's height and strength demonstrated the ruler's ability to command labor and resources on a massive scale, while its elegant proportions showed their appreciation for aesthetic beauty and mathematical harmony. Within the great enclosure, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a complex and sophisticated society. The foundations of numerous buildings suggest a substantial population of elite residents, while artifacts recovered from the site speak of wealth and international connections that rivaled those of any contemporary civilization. Chinese porcelain, Persian glass, and Indian beads have all been found within the walls. Evidence of trade networks that spanned the Indian Ocean and connected Zimbabwe to the great commercial centers of Asia. The hill complex, built on the granite kopje that overlooks the great enclosure, served as both fortress and palace for Zimbabwe's rulers. This remarkable structure took advantage of the natural contours and defenses provided by the granite boulders, incorporating them into a building complex that was virtually impregnable to attack while providing spectacular views of the surrounding countryside. The narrow passages between the rocks were carefully planned to channel visitors along predetermined routes, creating a sense of mystery and controlled access that enhanced the ruler's prestige and authority. Archaeological evidence suggests that the hill complex served not only as a residence but also as a center for religious and ceremonial activities. Stone platforms and enclosures within the complex may have been used for rituals connected to ancestor worship, while the famous carved soapstone birds found at the site probably served as religious symbols or totems representing the spiritual power of Zimbabwe's rulers. These birds, with their distinctive stylized forms and mysterious expressions, have become symbols of modern Zimbabwe, their images appearing on the national flag and currency. The society that created Great Zimbabwe was sophisticated in ways that went far beyond impressive architecture. Archaeological evidence reveals a complex economy based not only on trade but also on agriculture, cattle herding, and various forms of craft production. The people of Zimbabwe were skilled metalworkers who could produce both iron and gold objects of exceptional quality. They were accomplished potters whose ceramics showed both technical skill and artistic sophistication. They were successful farmers who developed agricultural techniques adapted to the local environment and climate. The political structure that governed Great Zimbabwe appears to have been based on concepts of divine kingship similar to those found in other parts of Africa. The rulers claimed authority not only over their human subjects, but also over the spiritual forces that governed the natural world. They served as intermediaries between the living and the ancestors, conducting rituals that ensured the continued prosperity of their people and the fertility of their lands. This spiritual dimension of political power was reinforced by the professive architecture and material wealth that surrounded the royal court. The wealth that supported this elaborate political and religious system came primarily from Great Zimbabwe's position as the center of a far-flung trading network. Gold from the surrounding region was gathered and processed at the site before being transported to the coast for export to international markets. Ivory from elephant herds was similarly collected and processed. In return, luxury goods from across the known world flowed back to Zimbabwe, creating a cosmopolitan court culture that was connected to developments in Asia, the Middle East, and other parts of Africa. The scale of this trade was enormous by any standards. Conservative estimates suggest that during its peak period, Great Zimbabwe controlled the export of tens of thousands of ounces of gold annually, wealth that funded not only the impressive buildings but also the complex administrative structure necessary to manage such far-flung commercial operations. The site served as headquarters for a trading empire that extended across much of southeastern Africa, with subsidiary settlements and trading posts, controlling resources and routes throughout the region. The people who created this remarkable civilization left behind few written records, but their material culture speaks eloquently of their achievements and aspirations. The careful planning evident in Great Zimbabwe's architecture suggests a society that thought in terms of centuries rather than years, that was confident enough in its future to invest enormous resources in permanent monuments. The international trade goods found at the site indicate a cosmopolitan outlook that embraced contact with distant cultures while maintaining a distinctly African identity. The artistic achievements of Great Zimbabwe were as impressive as its commercial and political successes. The famous soapstone birds represent only the most well-known examples of a sophisticated artistic tradition that included decorated pottery, carved ivory, and worked gold objects of exceptional beauty. The architectural decoration found throughout the site, including the distinctive chevron patterns that adorn the walls of the great enclosure, shows an aesthetic sensibility that was both indigenous and innovative. For more than 3 centuries, Great Zimbabwe stood as one of the most important cities in the southern African region, its influence extending across vast areas and its reputation spreading to distant lands. The city's population may have reached 20,000 at its peak, making it one of the largest urban centers in sub-Saharan Africa during the medieval period. Its rulers commanded resources and wielded influence that made them major players in the Indian Ocean commercial system. But even the greatest civilizations must eventually face decline, and Great Zimbabwe was no exception. By the 15th century, the site was showing signs of strain that would eventually lead to its abandonment. The reasons for this decline were complex and interrelated, involving environmental, political, and economic factors that combined to undermine the foundations of Zimbabwe's power and prosperity. Environmental degradation played a significant role in Zimbabwe's decline. The large population and extensive cattle herds had placed increasing pressure on the local environment, leading to deforestation, soil erosion, and declining agricultural productivity. The region's climate may also have become less favorable during this period, with reduced rainfall making agriculture more difficult and cattle herding less productive. These environmental problems made it increasingly difficult to support the large population that the city's political and economic functions required. Political factors also contributed to the decline. The wealth and success of Great Zimbabwe had attracted the attention of ambitious rivals, leading to increased military pressure and political instability. New centers of power were emerging in other parts of the region, challenging Zimbabwe's control over trade routes and resources. The unity that had been essential to the city's success began to fragment as different groups pursued their own interests rather than working together for common goals. Perhaps most importantly, changes in the broader Indian Ocean trading system reduced the advantages that had made Great Zimbabwe so successful. Portuguese exploration of the African coast in the late 15th century disrupted traditional trade patterns and created new opportunities for coastal peoples at the expense of interior centers like Zimbabwe. The shift from trans-Saharan to maritime trade routes that had benefited Great Zimbabwe was now working against it as European traders established direct contacts with coastal African societies. By 1450 CE, Great Zimbabwe had been largely abandoned, its population dispersed to smaller settlements throughout the region. The great stone walls still stood, but the bustling markets and crowded residential areas that had given the city its life and purpose were gone. The buildings that had taken centuries to construct were left to the gradual conquest of vegetation and weather, slowly disappearing beneath the encroaching bush. The abandonment of Great Zimbabwe did not mark the end of the civilization that had created it. The people of Zimbabwe carried their skills, traditions, and political concepts with them to new locations, establishing successor states that continued many of the patterns that had made Great Zimbabwe successful. The kingdom of Mutapa, which arose to the north, inherited much of Zimbabwe's territory and trade connections. The Torwa state, centered at Komi, continued the architectural and artistic traditions that Zimbabwe had pioneered for centuries after its abandonment. Great Zimbabwe remained a mystery to the outside world. Local peoples continued to visit the site for ceremonial purposes, maintaining oral traditions that preserved some knowledge of its history and significance. But to European explorers and archaeologists who began investigating the ruins in the late 19th century, Great Zimbabwe presented a puzzle that challenged their assumptions about African capabilities and achievements. The impressive nature of the ruins led many early European observers to conclude that they could not have been built by indigenous Africans. Elaborate theories were developed, attributing the construction to Phoenicians, Arabs, or other non-African peoples, theories that said more about European prejudices than about African realities. It was only through careful archaeological investigation in the 20th century that the true nature of Great Zimbabwe was revealed, establishing beyond doubt that this remarkable achievement was the work of African peoples using African techniques and pursuing African goals today. Great Zimbabwe stands as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, its ruins protected and studied by archaeologists from around the world. The site continues to yield new insights into the sophistication and achievements of medieval African civilizations, challenging stereotypes and expanding our understanding of the African past. The stone walls that once enclosed a bustling city now enclose a space filled with the whispers of history, a reminder that human achievement has never been limited by geography or ethnicity, but has flourished wherever people have possessed the vision and determination to create something greater than themselves. As the African sun sets behind the granite hills of Zimbabwe, casting long shadows across the ancient stones, visitors can still sense something of the pride and ambition that drove the builders of this remarkable city. In the careful fitting of stone upon stone, in the elegant curves of the great enclosure's walls, in the commanding position of the hill complex, we can read the story of a people who refused to accept limitations, who dreamed on a scale that matched the vastness of the African landscape, and who created monuments that would outlast their empire by centuries. Their achievement stands as proof that human creativity and ambition are universal qualities, that the desire to build something permanent and beautiful knows no boundaries of race or geography, endless waters that would carry their legacy to every corner of the known world, where purple dye would become more precious than gold, and letters would replace the cumbersome symbols of empires past. In the narrow coastal plains, where mountains met the endless Mediterranean, there arose a people who would teach the world to think in letters rather than pictures. The Phoenicians emerged from cities that clung to rocky harbors like jewels set in bronze dia, sighed in bibulous names that would echo through history long after their last ship had sailed into legend. They were not conquerors who built vast armies or emperors who raised monuments to their own glory. Instead, they became something far more enduring, the patient weavers of a web that would span continents, connecting distant shores through the simple yet revolutionary act of trade. The morning mist that rolled in from the sea, each dawn seemed to whisper secrets to these coastal dwellers, secrets of navigation that would carry them beyond the horizon, where other sailors feared to venture. Their ships, with hulls curved like crescents and sails dyed the color of wine, rode the swells with a grace that spoke of generations spent learning the moods of water and wind. The Phoenicians understood that the sea was not a barrier but a highway, not an enemy to be conquered but a partner to be courted with skill and respect. In the workshops that lined their harbors, artisans performed what seemed like magic to those who witnessed it. They took shells, simple, common murex shells that any child might find scattered on the beach, and from them extracted a dye so rich, so magnificent, that it would become the mark of royalty itself. The process was laborious, requiring thousands of shells to produce even small amounts of the precious purple substance. Workers would crush the shells, extract the tiny glands that held the color, and then begin the delicate process of fermentation and refinement that transformed humble sea creatures into liquid wealth. The secret lay not just in the technique, but in understanding the subtle variations that could produce different shades, from the deep violet that adorned the robes of kings to the lighter lavender that marked the garments of lesser nobles. This purple, known as Tyrian purple, after their great city of Tyre, became so synonymous with power and prestige that the very word purple would forever carry connotations of majesty. Roman senators would stripe their togas with it, Byzantine emperors would wrap themselves in it, and for centuries the wearing of true purple would be restricted by law to those of royal blood. But the Phoenicians were merchants first, and they understood that a monopoly built on a single product, no matter how precious, was a fragile foundation for lasting prosperity. Their ships carried far more than purple dye across the wind-dark sea. They loaded their vessels with cedar wood from the forests of Lebanon, timber so fine that kings would import it to build their temples and palaces. They traded in glass, creating vessels of such clarity and beauty that they seemed to capture light itself. Their metalworkers crafted bronze implements and jewelry with a skill that made their products coveted throughout the ancient world. Yet perhaps their greatest cargo was invisible, the alphabet itself. Where other civilizations struggled with complex systems of hieroglyphs or cuneiform that required years of study to master, the Phoenicians developed something revolutionary in its simplicity. They created a writing system based on sounds rather than concepts, using just 22 letters that could be combined to represent any word in their language. This innovation transformed writing from a skill possessed only by trained scribes into something that ordinary merchants could learn and use in their daily business. The beauty of their system lay in its practicality. A trader needed to record transactions, track inventory, and communicate with partners across great distances. The Phoenician alphabet made this possible in a way that the elaborate writing systems of Egypt or Mesopotamia never could. As Phoenician merchants established trading posts throughout the Mediterranean, they carried this gift of literacy with them. Local populations adapted the letters to their own languages, creating the foundations for Greek and Latin, alphabets that would eventually give birth to virtually every modern writing system in the Western world. Their ships pushed ever outward, following currents and stars to lands that existed only in rumor and dream. They established colonies not as conquered territories but as willing partnerships, settlements that could serve as way stations for their far-ranging trade networks. Carthage, perhaps their most famous colony, began as just such a trading post on the North African coast. What started as a small harbor where ships could take on fresh water and supplies grew into a city that would one day challenge Rome itself for dominion over the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians sailed beyond the Mediterranean, through the narrow strait that marked the edge of the known world, into waters that other sailors believed led to the rim of existence itself. They established colonies along the Atlantic coasts of Spain and Morocco, trading for silver and tin that would be essential components in bronze making. Some scholars believe their ships may have reached as far north as Cornwall in Britain, seeking the tin deposits that were crucial to ancient metalworking. Their navigational skills became legendary throughout the ancient world, while other sailors hugged coastlines and feared the open sea. Phoenician captains learned to read the stars with such precision that they could maintain course across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. They understood the seasonal patterns of winds and currents, knew which stars remained constant through the night and which could guide them home when all other landmarks had vanished below the horizon. This knowledge was closely guarded, passed down from father to son, from mentor to apprentice, creating a maritime tradition that would endure for centuries in their cities. Life moved to the rhythm of the tides and the cycles of trade. The harbors, filled with ships in spring and summer, when favorable winds made long voyages possible. Merchants would spend the winter months planning new expeditions, studying reports from distant markets, negotiating partnerships that would shape the following year's trade. The cities themselves reflected this commercial focus, less concerned with monumental architecture than with practical infrastructure. Their harbors were marvels of engineering, with artificial islands and breakwaters that provided safe anchorage. For large fleets, the warehouses that lined their ports stored goods from across the known world. Cedar beams from their own mountains lay next to ivory from Africa, precious stones from India beside amber from the distant Baltic. The air was thick with the scents of exotic spices, the sound of a dozen languages mixing in the polyglot atmosphere of international commerce. Phoenician cities became cosmopolitan in a way that few ancient settlements ever achieved. Places where ideas and innovations moved as freely as goods and gold. Their religious practices reflected their maritime nature and commercial concerns. They worshipped deities who protected sailors and blessed trade ventures. Gods who understood the precarious nature of life lived at the mercy of wind and wave. Melkart, their patron deity, was both protector of the city and guardian of commerce, embodying the connection between prosperity and divine favor that was central to Phoenician worldview. They built temples not just as places of worship but as centers of trade, where merchants could meet under the protection of the gods to negotiate deals and resolve disputes. The decline of Phoenician power came not through military conquest or sudden collapse, but through the gradual rise of rivals who learned their lessons too well. The Greeks and Romans, initially customers and junior partners in Mediterranean trade, slowly developed their own maritime capabilities and commercial networks. As these competitors grew stronger, the Phoenician advantage began to erode. Their scattered colonies, connected by sea routes rather than land-based empires, proved vulnerable when other powers learned to challenge them on their own element. Yet, their legacy endured in ways that outlasted any empire built on military might. Every time a student learns to read, they engage with a descendant of the Phoenician alphabet. Every commercial transaction that crosses international borders follows patterns they established. The very concept of international trade as a peaceful exchange that benefits all parties owes much to their example. They proved that wealth and influence could be built on mutual benefit rather than conquest. on knowledge and skill rather than force of arms, as Phoenician ships carried their revolutionary ideas across the Mediterranean. Far to the east, another. People were carving their own legacy from the living rock itself, creating monuments that would outlast empires and challenge the very desert that surrounded them. In the harsh but hauntingly beautiful landscape where ancient trade routes converged, the Nabateans built a civilization that seemed to grow directly from the stone beneath their feet. The red sandstone cliffs of southern Jordan held secrets that would remain hidden for over 1,000 years after the last Nabatean ruler was laid to rest. Here, in a landscape that seemed too harsh to sustain any civilization, a people arose who understood that survival in the desert required not just adaptation but transformation, the ability to see opportunity where others saw only obstacle, to find abundance in apparent scarcity, and to create beauty in the midst of desolation. The Nabateans began as nomads, tribes who moved with their herds across the vast expanses of the Arabian Peninsula, following the ancient rhythms of water and pasture that had governed desert life since time immemorial. But unlike other nomadic peoples who remained content with their wandering existence, the Nabateans possessed a vision that transformed them from herders into architects of one of the ancient world's most remarkable trading empires. They recognized that their knowledge of desert routes and water sources was not just survival information, but commercial intelligence of the highest value. The turning point came when they began to understand the true worth of the incense and spices that passed through their territory. Frankincense and myrrh, produced in the distant kingdoms of southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa, were as precious as gold to the temples and palaces of the Mediterranean world. These aromatic resins were essential to religious ceremonies, used in embalming practices, and prized for their medicinal properties. The demand seemed inexhaustible, and the Nabateans found themselves perfectly positioned to control the routes that carried these treasures to their eager markets. But control of trade routes in the desert was meaningless without control of water. And here the Nabateans displayed engineering genius that rivaled the greatest hydraulic achievements of the ancient world. They developed a sophisticated understanding of hydrology that allowed them to harvest and store water with remarkable efficiency. In the seemingly barren landscape around Petra, they constructed an elaborate network of dams, cisterns, and channels that captured every drop of rainfall and channeled it to where it was needed most. Their water management system was a marvel of ancient engineering, so effective that it allowed them to support a population of several thousand people in the heart of the desert. They carved elaborate settling tanks where collected water could be purified, removing sand and debris through a series of chambers that used gravity and filtration to produce clean, drinkable water. Underground cisterns, some capable of holding hundreds of thousands of gallons, were hewn from solid rock and lined with plaster that prevented seepage and contamination. The knowledge of water sources became the foundation of Nabatean power. They alone knew which valleys might yield springs after seasonal rains, which rock formations indicated underground streams, and how to construct the capture systems that could collect moisture from the briefest desert showers. This expertise made them indispensable to any caravans seeking to cross their territory, and they leveraged this advantage into a monopoly over the incense trade that brought them unprecedented wealth. As their prosperity grew, the Nabateans made a decision that would create one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in the world. Rather than building their capital from wood and mud brick like most ancient peoples, they chose to carve their city directly from the living rock. The red and pink sandstone of their chosen location possessed a quality that made it both workable undurable, soft enough to be carved with bronze and iron tools, yet hard enough to withstand centuries of weathering. The creation of Petra was an undertaking that spanned generations. Skilled masons, many likely trained in the architectural traditions of Egypt and Greece, worked alongside local craftsmen who understood the unique properties of Nabatean stone. They began with the most sacred structures, tombs for their rulers, that were carved as elaborate facades reaching high into the cliff faces. These monuments were designed not just to house the dead, but to proclaim the power and permanence of Nabatean civilization to all who entered their territory. The treasury, despite its popular name, was almost certainly a royal tomb, but its purpose mattered less than its impact. Rising over 120 feet into the pink stone of the cliff face, it represented a fusion of architectural traditions that reflected the cosmopolitan nature of Nabatean culture. Greek columns and pediments, combined with Arabian decorative elements and Egyptian influences, to create something entirely newer, distinctly Nabatean aesthetic that spoke of their role as cultural intermediaries between different civilizations. The process of carving such monuments required not just artistic vision, but engineering precision. Workers had to begin at the top of the cliff and work their way down, removing vast quantities of stone while maintaining perfect proportions and intricate decorative details. The tools they used were simple bronze and iron chisels, wooden levers, and human muscle, but their results were anything but crude. Every column, every capital, every decorative frieze was carved with a precision that would challenge modern stonemasons. The city that grew around these monuments was equally impressive, though much of it has been lost to time and the elements. Streets were carved from bedrock and lined with drainage channels that carried away flash floods. Houses and shops were hewn from cliff faces, their rooms connected by corridors that provided natural cooling in the intense desert heat. Public buildings, including theaters and temples, were constructed on a scale that reflected the wealth and ambition of their builders. The Nabatean theater, carved from a hillside and capable of seating several thousand spectators, demonstrated their adoption and adaptation of Greek cultural forms. Yet they modified these borrowed elements to suit their own needs and aesthetic preferences. The acoustic properties were carefully calculated to ensure that performers could be heard throughout. The structure without artificial amplification. The orientation took advantage of prevailing winds to provide natural cooling, while the surrounding architecture was designed to minimize the impact of sandstorms and seasonal flooding. Religion in Nabatean society reflected their diverse cultural influences and commercial connections. They worshipped Arabian deities alongside Greek and Egyptian gods, creating a syncretic religious system that paralleled their eclectic architectural style. Their temples incorporated elements from multiple traditions, with altars that could accommodate different ritual practices and sacred spaces that reflected the multicultural nature of their trading empire. The god Kush, their principal deity, was associated with mountains and fertility, appropriate for a people who had learned to find life in the harsh desert landscape. Worship involved elaborate ceremonies that often culminated in communal feasts, reflecting the importance of hospitality in Nabatean culture. These religious celebrations also served important commercial and political functions, providing opportunities for traders from different regions to meet and negotiate under the protection of divine hospitality. Their pottery revealed another dimension of Nabatean artistic achievement. Working with local clays, they developed a distinctive ceramic tradition that combined practical functionality with remarkable aesthetic sophistication. Their vessels were not just containers but works of art, decorated with intricate patterns that drew on motifs from across the ancient world. The quality of their ceramics was so high that Nabatean pottery became a luxury export, carried by their own caravans. To markets throughout the region, the painting technique they developed was particularly innovative. Using slip painting, they could create incredibly fine details and subtle color gradations that gave their pottery an almost metallic appearance. These decorative techniques influenced ceramic traditions throughout the ancient Near East, and examples of Nabatean pottery have been found in archaeological sites from Egypt to Mesopotamia, testament to the reach of their trading networks. The decline of Nabatean power came gradually, the result of changing trade patterns rather than sudden conquest. As Roman control over Egypt tightened, alternative routes for the spice trade began to develop. Ships could carry goods more efficiently than caravans, and the Red Sea routes that bypassed Nabatean territory became increasingly attractive to merchants. The Roman annexation of the Nabatean kingdom in 106 CE was more administrative formality than military conquest, recognition of a reality that had been developing for decades. Yet the Romans recognized the value of what the Nabateans had created. Petra continued to thrive as a Roman city for several more centuries. Its unique architecture and engineering achievements preserved and maintained by its new rulers. The water systems continued to function. The carved monuments continued to inspire awe, and the city remained an important stop on the trade routes that connected the Roman Empire with the wealth of the East. The final abandonment of Petra came, not through violence, but through irrelevance, as trade patterns shifted decisively toward maritime routes and new cities rose to prominence along different corridors of commerce. The carved city gradually emptied. The desert, patient and eternal, slowly began to reclaim what human hands had carved from its stone. Sand drifted into the streets, wind and rain wore at the carved facades, and the sophisticated water systems fell into disrepair without the constant maintenance they required. While the carved stones of Petra held their secrets beneath shifting sands, far to the east another civilization was reaching heights of architectural and cultural achievement that would create some of humanity's most magnificent monuments. In the steaming jungles of Southeast Asia, where monsoon rains fed mighty rivers and ancient trade routes carried the wealth of continents, the Khmer Empire was building temples that seemed to bridge the earthly and the divine. The Great Lake of tonal sap expanded and contracted with the rhythm of the seasons, its waters fed by monsoon rains that transformed the landscape from dusty plain to verdant floodplain with each annual cycle. It was here, in this rich and watery world, that the Khmer people built an empire that would endure for 6 centuries and create architectural wonders that continue to inspire awe nearly a millennium after their builders laid down their tools. The story of the Khmer Empire is inseparable from the story of water, how to harness it, channel it, store it, and use it to create abundance in a land where feast and famine could alternate with devastating regularity. The founder of Angkor, King Jayavarman, understood that true power in this landscape came not from armies alone, but from the ability to command the waters that brought life to the land. In 802 CE, he established his capital in a location chosen not for its defensive advantages or its proximity to existing cities, but for its potential to become the center of the most sophisticated hydraulic engineering system the world had ever seen. The site offered access to the Tonle Sap Lake, proximity to the Mekong River system, and terrain that could be shaped to support an elaborate network of canals, reservoirs, and irrigation channels. The Khmer engineers who designed Angkor's water management system possessed an understanding of hydraulics that would not be matched until the modern era. They recognized that controlling water flow required more than simply digging channels. It demanded a comprehensive understanding of elevation, seasonal variation, soil drainage, and the complex interactions between natural and artificial waterways. Their solution was revolutionary in its scope and breathtaking in its ambition. They would reshape the landscape itself to create a man-made ecosystem that could support a population of over 1 million people. The great reservoirs, called Beri, were the centerpieces of this system. These were not simple ponds, but massive artificial lakes, some stretching for miles and capable of holding billions of gallons of water. The East Beret, one of the largest, measured over 4 miles long and nearly 2 miles wide, a body of water, so vast that it created its own microclimate and supported extensive agricultural activities along its shores. These reservoirs served multiple functions. They stored water for the dry season, prevented flooding during the monsoons, and provided the constant supply of water needed for the elaborate temple complexes that were the heart of Khmer civilization. The construction of these reservoirs required moving millions of cubic feet of earth, using only human labor and simple tools. Workers dug the massive basins by hand, using bronze implements and wicker baskets to move soil that would form the dikes and embankments that contained the waters. The precision required was extraordinary. The water levels had to be calculated exactly to ensure proper flow throughout the system, and the construction had to be robust enough to withstand the tremendous pressure of the stored water and the destructive force of seasonal floods from these great reservoirs. An intricate network of canals carried water throughout the Angkor region. These waterways were not merely functional, but formed part of the sacred geography of the empire. The Khmer conceived of their capital as an earthly representation of the cosmic order, with the great temple of Angkor Wat at its center representing Mount Meroe, the sacred mountain at the center of the universe in Hindu cosmology. The canals and reservoirs that surrounded the temple complex were understood as the cosmic ocean that surrounded the sacred mountain, making the entire city a mandala carved from earth and water. This fusion of practical engineering and religious symbolism reached its greatest expression in Angkor Wat itself. Begun in the early 12th century under King Suryavarman VII, the temple was conceived as both a place of worship and a massive public works project that would demonstrate the power and piety of its builder. Its construction required the labor of thousands of workers over several decades, and its completion represented the culmination of centuries of architectural and engineering innovation. The temple rises from its surroundings like a stone mountain, its 5 towers representing the peaks of Mount Meroe. But this symbolism was achieved through engineering techniques that were remarkably sophisticated. The builders had to create a structure massive enough to support the weight of towering stone spires while intricate enough to accommodate the elaborate sculptural programs that covered virtually every surface. They solved this challenge by developing a construction method that combined solid stone foundations with carefully calculated weight distribution that allowed for both structural integrity and artistic elaboration. The stone used in Angkor Wat came from quarries located over 20 miles away, transported to the construction site by a combination of river barges and elephant-drawn carts. Each block had to be precisely cut and fitted, as the Khmer builders used no mortar in their construction. Instead, they relied on the precise fitting of stones and the strategic use of weight and tension to create structures that have withstood centuries of earthquakes, floods, and the inexorable pressure of tropical vegetation. The sculptural decoration of Angkor Wat represents one of the greatest achievements in the history of architectural art. Miles of bas-relief carvings tell the stories of Hindu epics, Buddhist teachings, and Khmer history in a visual narrative that transforms the temple walls into vast stone books. The level of detail is extraordinary. Individual figures are carved with such precision that facial expressions, clothing details, and even jewelry can be clearly distinguished. The scenes flow together in compositions that demonstrate not just technical skill but a sophisticated understanding of visual storytelling. The famous relief depicting the churning of the ocean of milk from Hindu mythology stretches for over 150 feet along the temple's gallery walls. Gods and demons work together to churn the cosmic ocean and produce the elixir of immortality. Their figures carved in dynamic poses that seem to capture the very moment of action. The artistic achievement is matched by the precision of the execution. Every figure is perfectly proportioned, every detail carefully considered, every element contributing to the overall narrative impact of the scene. But Angkor Wat was only the most famous of dozens of temple complexes that dotted the Khmer capital. Each ruler sought to surpass his predecessors in the magnificence of his temple building, creating a landscape filled with architectural marvels that reflected different periods, styles, and religious influences. The Bayon, built by Jayavarman VII in the late 12th century, presents a very different aesthetic from Angkor Wat, where the earlier temple emphasized horizontal lines and classical proportions. The Bayon rises in a forest of towers, each one carved with massive faces that smile down on visitors with expressions of serene benevolence. These face towers, over 200 of them when the temple was complete, represent one of the most psychologically powerful architectural achievements in human history. Each face measures over 8 feet in height, and their positioning ensures that visitors to the temple are constantly under their gentle but watchful gaze. Some scholars believe the faces represent Avalokitesvara, the Buddhist bodhisattva of compassion, while others suggest they may be idealized portraits of Jayavarman VII himself. Regardless of their specific identity, their impact is unmistakable. They transform the temple into a living presence that seems to embody the spiritual authority of the Khmer kings. The daily life of Angkor's inhabitants revolved around this fusion of the practical and the sacred. The city's population included not just the royal court and the thousands of workers needed to maintain the temples and water systems, but also merchants, artisans, farmers, and fishermen whose activities sustained the urban center. The great reservoirs supported aquaculture on a massive scale, fish farming that provided protein for the city's population while utilizing water resources with remarkable efficiency. The agricultural system that fed Angkor was equally sophisticated. The controlled flooding made possible by the hydraulic engineering allowed for multiple rice harvests per year, transforming the region into one of the most productive agricultural areas in Southeast Asia. The surplus production supported not just the local population but extensive trade networks that carried Khmer rice to markets throughout the region. This agricultural abundance was the foundation that made possible the massive temple building projects and the elaborate court culture that characterized the Khmer Empire at its height. Trade brought wealth and cultural influences from across Asia to Angkor. Chinese ceramics, Indian textiles, precious metals from Burma, and spices from the Indonesian archipelago flowed through the Khmer capital, making it one of the most cosmopolitan cities of the medieval world. The temples themselves reflect this cultural diversity. Hindu religious themes predominate. But Buddhist influences are also present, and the architectural styles show elements borrowed from Indian, Javanese, and indigenous Khmer traditions. The Khmer court developed elaborate ceremonies that reinforced the divine status of the king while celebrating the cultural achievements of the empire. Royal festivals involved thousands of participants in processions that moved through the temple complexes, creating spectacles that must have been breathtaking in their scale and magnificence. These ceremonies served important political functions, demonstrating the power and legitimacy of royal authority, while providing opportunities for different regions of the empire to display their loyalty and receive royal favor. The beginning of Angkor's decline came not through external conquest, but through internal challenges that the sophisticated systems of the empire ultimately could not overcome. Climate change, possibly related to global cooling trends in the 14th and 15th centuries, disrupted the monsoon patterns that the hydraulic system depended upon. Periods of drought alternated with devastating floods in ways that the engineering systems, designed for predictable seasonal variation, could not accommodate. The maintenance requirements of the hydraulic system had always been enormous, requiring constant attention from skilled engineers and vast amounts of manual labor. As agricultural productivity declined due to climatic stress, it became increasingly difficult to maintain the elaborate infrastructure that made urban life possible. Canals silted up, reservoirs developed leaks, and the carefully balanced water management system began to fail in cascading ways that proved impossible to repair. Political pressures also contributed to the empire's decline. The rise of Thai kingdoms to the west created military threats that required increasing resources to counter, while the costs of maintaining the vast temple complexes continued to drain the royal treasury. The very magnificence that had made Angkor great became a burden that the declining economy could no longer support. Gradually, the court began to shift its attention to other regions, and the great capital started its long slide toward abandonment. The final abandonment of Angkor came gradually, as the jungle slowly reclaimed what human hands had built. The temples, designed to last for eternity, proved more durable than the civilization that created them. Vines crept over the carved walls, trees took root in the joints between stones, and the intricate water management system fell into ruins. By the time European explorers reached the site in the 19th century, the great city had become a series of mysterious ruins. Merchants who traded their precious purple dye across continents, their legacy written not in stone monuments but in the very DNA of commerce itself, in the alphabet that still shapes human thought, in the ports that became the seeds of cities yet to bloom. The purple that once adorned emperors had faded from memory, but the pathways they carved across the Mediterranean's blue expanse remained, invisible highways that future civilizations would follow without ever knowing who first traced these routes through wind and wave, far beyond the reach of Mediterranean merchants, beyond the furthest dreams of Angkor's builders, beyond the carved cliffs of Petra and the terraced hills of Great Zimbabwe. There existed a speck of land so remote that it seemed to float in the ocean like a forgotten thought. Rapa Nui, which the world would come to know as Easter Island, emerged from the Pacific's vast blue emptiness, like a mirage made of volcanic stone and wind-swept grass, carrying within its small borders one of humanity's most haunting mysteries. The island had been born from fire, thrust upward from the ocean floor by forces so ancient that they predated human memory. 3 volcanoes had shaped its triangular form, their craters now silent and grass-filled, their slopes gentle with the passage of millennia. When the first Polynesian voyagers arrived, Sometime between the 8th and 12th centuries, they found a world unto itself, an ecosystem delicate as spun glass, isolated by thousands of miles of ocean from any other land. These early settlers, master navigators who had read the stars like a familiar book and followed the flight patterns of birds across impossible distances, brought with them the seeds of a civilization that would bloom in solitude. They carried sweet potatoes and taro, chickens and rats, and most importantly, they carried the accumulated wisdom of island living that their ancestors had perfected across the scattered atolls and volcanic peaks of Polynesia. The island they discovered was a paradise of sorts, though a fragile one. Palm forests covered the slopes, their fronds whispering secrets to the trade winds. Seabirds nested in such numbers that their cries formed a constant symphony, and the waters around the island teemed with fish. The volcanic soil, enriched by countless years of ash and erosion, proved fertile for the crops they planted. In this isolation, the Rapa Nui people began to craft a society unlike any other on Earth. As generations passed, the island's population grew, and with it, the complexity of their social organization. Chiefs emerged, then priests, then master craftsmen whose skills would be passed down through bloodlines like sacred flames. The Rapa Nui developed their own language, their own customs, their own understanding of the cosmos that surrounded their tiny world. They created a writing system called Rongorongo, mysterious glyphs carved into wooden tablets that seemed to dance with life, depicting birds and fish, humans and geometric patterns in combinations that scholars still struggle to decipher. But it was the Moai that would become the island's immortal voice, speaking across centuries to anyone who encountered their silent vigil. These great stone heads, which actually possessed full bodies, buried by centuries of soil accumulation, began to appear around 1250 CE, emerging from the workshops at Rano Raraku Quarry, like thoughts given physical form. The Rapa Nui master carvers worked with basalt picks and obsidian chisels, slowly coaxing these giants from the volcanic tuff with a patience that spoke of deep spiritual purpose. Each Moai was unique, despite their familial resemblance. Some stood nearly 40 feet tall and weighed as much as 80 tons, their massive heads tilted slightly upward as if listening to distant voices. Their faces were severe yet serene, with prominent noses, thin lips, and deep eye sockets that once held coral and obsidian eyes that gazed inland, watching over the villages and ceremonial centers where their descendants lived. The red scoria topknots, called pukao, that crowned many of the Moai were quarried from a different location entirely and somehow transported to rest atop these massive heads, adding another layer of mystery to their construction. The process of creating and moving these giants consumed the island's attention for centuries. Entire communities organized around the quarrying, carving, and transportation of the Moai, developing techniques that required unprecedented cooperation. Some theories suggest they walked the statues upright across the island using a complex system of ropes and coordinated movement, a possibility that breathes life into the Rapa Nui legends that claimed the Moai moved of their own accord. As the Moai multiplied, spreading across the island like silent sentinels, the Rapa Nui society reached heights of sophistication that belied their isolation. They developed complex agricultural systems, creating Manavai circular stone gardens that protected crops from the salt winds. They built ahu, massive stone platforms that served as both burial sites and foundations for their Moai. Some of these structures rivaling the precision of any megalithic construction in the world. The island became a sacred landscape where every Stone held meaning, every hill possessed a name. Every bay contained stories passed down through generations of storytellers. The Rapa Nui developed elaborate ceremonial cycles, including the Tangata Manu, or birdman cult, where young men would swim to offshore islets to collect the first sooty tern egg of the season, the winner becoming the spiritual leader for the year. These rituals connected the people to the rhythms of the ocean, the migrations of birds, the subtle changes in wind and weather that governed life on their isolated home, but paradise, especially one as fragile as an isolated island ecosystem, carries within it the seeds of its own transformation. As the population grew, pressure mounted on the island's limited resources. The palm forests that had once covered the island began to disappear, cut down for canoe construction, house building, and perhaps most crucially, for the rollers and ropes needed to transport the ever larger moi. Archaeological evidence suggests that by 1650, the last palm tree on the island had been felled, fundamentally altering the ecosystem in ways that would cascade through every aspect of Rapa Nui life. Without trees, the soil began to erode more rapidly under the constant trade. Winds. Without large canoes, deep-sea fishing became impossible, forcing the islanders to rely more heavily on coastal resources that were already under pressure. The bird populations that had once darkened the skies with their numbers began to decline as their nesting sites disappeared. The island that had once been self-sufficient began to show signs of ecological stress that would only intensify with time. Social tensions accompanied environmental degradation. Competition for dwindling resources led to conflicts between different clans and regions of the island. The moai construction, which had once united the island in common purpose, eventually ceased as communities turned their energy toward survival. Some of the great statues were toppled during these conflicts, their faces turned toward the earth, as if in mourning for the paradise that was slowly slipping away. When European explorers first encountered Rapa Nui on Easter Sunday, 1722, they found an island population of perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 people living in what appeared to them to be poverty and isolation. The Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen and his crew could not comprehend how such a small population could have created the monumental statues they found scattered across the landscape. This disconnect between the evident sophistication required to create the moai and the apparently simple society they encountered gave birth to countless theories about the island's past. What the Europeans could not see was that they were witnessing a civilization in transition, one that had already adapted once to fundamental changes in their environment and was continuing to evolve. The Rapa Nui had not disappeared. They had transformed, developing new cultural practices and social structures suited to their changed circumstances. The Birdman cult represented this adaptation, shifting focus from monument building to annual rituals that reinforced social cohesion and spiritual connection to the natural world. The contact with European civilization brought new challenges that would test the Rapa Nui's resilience even further. Disease epidemics decimated the population, reducing it to perhaps a few hundred individuals by the late 19th century. Slave raids from Peru in 1862 removed many of the island's leaders and knowledge keepers, creating cultural gaps that would never be fully bridged. The introduction of Christianity overlaid new beliefs onto ancient traditions, creating hybrid practices that preserved elements of the old ways within new frameworks. Despite these profound disruptions, the Rapa Nui culture proved remarkably resilient. The people maintained their language, though it evolved to incorporate new vocabularies and concepts. They preserved oral traditions that connected them to their ancestors and their land. Even as the political control of their island passed to Chile, they continued to carve, though now they created small moai for visitors rather than massive monuments for the gods. Modern archaeological investigations have revealed that the traditional narrative of collapse on Easter Island oversimplifies a far more complex story of adaptation and survival. The Rapa Nui had developed sustainable agricultural practices that allowed them to support their population even after deforestation. They had created a stable society that persisted for centuries after the end of monumental construction. Their story became one of resilience rather than failure, of a people who faced unprecedented challenges and found ways to survive while maintaining their cultural identity. The moai themselves became symbols that transcended their original context, speaking to something universal in the human experience. Their mysterious faces, gazing inland with eternal patience, seemed to embody the longing that drives all human societies, the desire to create something that will outlast the brief span of individual lives, to leave marks upon the world that will continue to speak after the voices that created them have fallen silent. Contemporary Rapa Nui culture represents a synthesis of ancient traditions and modern realities. The descendants of the moai builders continue to live on their ancestral island, now serving as guardians of one of the world's most isolated and mysterious archaeological landscapes. They have become interpreters of their own heritage, sharing the stories of their ancestors while adapting to their role as inhabitants of a UNESCO World Heritage Site that attracts visitors from around the globe. The Rongorongo glyphs remain largely undeciphered, their wooden tablets holding secrets that may never be fully revealed. Some scholars believe they represent a unique form of proto-writing, while others argue they constitute a fully developed script. The mystery itself has become part of the island's enduring fascination, a reminder that not all of history's secrets yield to academic investigation. In recent decades, efforts to restore the island's ecology have begun to show promise. New trees are being planted, though they are not the native palms that once covered the slopes. Native plants are being reintroduced, and the traditional knowledge of the Rapa Nui people is being incorporated into conservation efforts. The island is slowly being transformed once again, this time through a conscious effort to balance cultural preservation with environmental restoration. The moai continued their eternal watch, their red top knots glowing in the sunset, their faces serene in the morning light. They have become perhaps the most recognizable symbols of any prehistoric civilization, their images reproduced countless times around the world. Yet they remain firmly rooted in their landscape, inseparable from the grass-covered hills and the endless horizon of the Pacific that stretches beyond them. High in the Bolivian Altiplano, where the air grows thin and the sky seems close enough to touch, another forgotten civilization once reached toward the heavens with monuments that defied both gravity and time. At an altitude of over 12,000 feet above sea level, where most plants struggle to grow and the cold can kill the unprepared, the builders of Tiwanaku created one of the most sophisticated urban centers in the pre-Columbian Americas, a city that would endure for over 1,000 years before mysteriously fading into legend. The site sits near the southeastern shore of Lake Titicaca, the world's highest navigable lake, whose deep blue waters stretch to distant mountains like an inland sea suspended between earth and sky. This lake, sacred to the peoples of the Andes, was believed to be the birthplace of the sun itself, the place where the first Incas emerged from its depths to establish their empire. Long before the Incas walked these shores, however, the architects of Tiwanaku were already shaping stone and moving massive blocks with a precision that would leave their successors in awe. The origins of Tiwanaku stretch back to around 300 BCE, but the city reached its greatest flowering between 500 and 1000 CE, when it served as the capital of a civilization that controlled vast territories across the Andes from their highland stronghold. The Tiwanaku people established trade networks that stretched from the Pacific coast to the Amazon basin, moving goods and ideas across some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. What they accomplished at their ceremonial center seems to defy the limitations of their technology. The structures at Tiwanaku were built using massive stone blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, fitted together with such precision that not even a knife blade could slip between the joints. These stones were quarried from sites located across the lake and transported over water and land using methods that remain largely mysterious. The effort required suggests a society with sophisticated organizational capabilities and a shared vision that could motivate enormous collective undertakings. The heart of Tiwanaku was the Akapana Pyramid, a stepped structure that rose from the high plain like an artificial mountain. Unlike the solid pyramids of Egypt or Mesoamerica, the Akapana was designed with internal chambers and a complex drainage system that collected rainwater and channeled it through carefully constructed channels. The pyramid's 7 terraces were oriented to astronomical alignments, and its summit may have served as an observatory where priest astronomers tracked the movements of celestial bodies across the thin atmosphere of the Altiplano. Adjacent to the pyramid stood the Kalasasaya Temple, a rectangular enclosure surrounded by massive standing stones that created one of the most precisely oriented astronomical instruments in the ancient world. The temple's walls were aligned to track the movements of the sun throughout the year, marking solstices and equinoxes with shadows that fell across specially placed stones. Within this temple stood the Gateway of the Sun, a monolithic arch carved from a single block of stone and decorated with intricate reliefs that may represent a sophisticated calendar system. The central figure carved on the Gateway of the Sun has become one of the most recognizable images from pre-Columbian America. This deity, often called the staff god, stands with arms outstretched, holding staffs topped with condor heads, surrounded by rows of smaller figures that seem to be flying or running toward the central figure. The precise meaning of these carvings remains debated, but they clearly represent a complex mythology that connected earthly and celestial realms. The precision of Tiwanaku's stonework rivals that of any civilization in history. The builders used techniques that allowed them to create perfectly flat surfaces and precise angles without metal tools, relying instead on stone hammers, bronze chisels, and an understanding of stone properties that approached the level of science. They developed methods for moving massive blocks across difficult terrain, probably using a combination of ramps, levers, and human labor organized on a scale that required sophisticated administrative systems that archaeological evidence suggests. That Tiwanaku was not just a ceremonial center, but a thriving urban area that may have housed as many as 15,000 people at its peak. The city was surrounded by extensive agricultural fields that used raised platforms called waru to cultivate crops in the challenging environment of the altitude. These agricultural innovations allowed the Tiwanaku people to grow corn, potatoes, and quinoa at altitudes where such cultivation should have been impossible. The waru system represented one of the most sophisticated forms of high-altitude agriculture ever developed. The raised platforms were surrounded by water-filled canals that moderated temperature extremes, protecting crops from both frost and drought. The system also created microclimates that extended the growing season and increased crop yields. Modern experiments with reconstructed waru have shown that they can produce significantly higher yields than conventional farming methods. Even with contemporary technology beyond agriculture, the Tiwanaku civilization excelled in metallurgy, textiles, and ceramics. Their bronze workers created tools and ornaments of exceptional quality, using techniques that allowed them to produce alloys with specific properties suited to different purposes. Their weavers created textiles with complex patterns and vivid colors derived from local plants and minerals. Their potters produced vessels that combined practical functionality with artistic sophistication, many decorated with images that echoed the cosmic themes found in their monumental architecture. The influence of Tiwanaku extended far beyond the immediate area around Lake Titicaca. Archaeological evidence shows that Tiwanaku goods and artistic styles spread throughout the Andes, from Colombia to northern Chile and Argentina. This expansion may have been achieved through trade rather than conquest, as the Tiwanaku people seem to have been more interested in economic exchange than military domination. Their merchants carried luxury goods and raw materials across vast distances, using llama caravans and probably boats on Lake Titicaca to move their wares. The economic foundation of Tiwanaku's power rested on their control of resources and trade routes. The Altiplano provided access to high-quality stone for construction, metals for tools and ornaments, and unique agricultural products adapted to high-altitude conditions. From their position near Lake Titicaca, they could control north-south trade routes that connected different ecological zones of the Andes, from the tropical lowlands to the frigid peaks. Religious practices at Tiwanaku seem to have centered on the worship of sky gods and the veneration of ancestors. The monumental architecture was designed to create spaces for large-scale ceremonies that probably involved thousands of participants. The acoustic properties of the temples suggest that they were designed to amplify sound, allowing priests to address large crowds during religious festivals. The ceremonial calendar was probably closely tied to agricultural cycles and astronomical observations, creating a complex system that integrated spiritual, practical, and scientific knowledge. The decline of Tiwanaku began around 1000 CE and appears to have been related to climate change that affected the entire Andean region. Tree ring data and ice core samples suggest that a severe drought lasting several decades reduced the level of Lake Titicaca and disrupted the agricultural systems that supported the civilization. Without the surplus production that had funded their monumental construction projects and supported their trade networks, Tiwanaku gradually lost its influence and power. The end of Tiwanaku was not sudden or catastrophic, but rather a gradual process of abandonment and transformation. As the climate became less favorable and trade networks collapsed, people gradually moved away from the ceremonial center to establish smaller settlements in areas that could still support agriculture. The great temples and pyramids were slowly abandoned to the elements, their stones serving as quarries for later builders who lacked the skills to create such monuments themselves. By the time the Incas rose to power in the Andes, Tiwanaku had become a legendary place associated with the creation of the world. Inca oral traditions claimed that their founders had emerged from Lake Titicaca near the ruins of Tiwanaku, and they incorporated many elements of Tiwanaku art and architecture into their own cultural expressions. The Incas recognized the superiority of Tiwanaku stonework and often claimed that the great monuments had been built by giants in the time before the present world was created. Spanish chroniclers who visited Tiwanaku in the 16th century were amazed by the sophistication of the ruins but could find no local people who could explain how they had been built. The techniques that had allowed the creation of such precise stonework had been lost, and the monuments stood as silent testimony to abilities that seemed impossible given the technologies that the Spanish understood. This disconnect between the evident sophistication of the ruins and the apparent simplicity of contemporary Andean societies led to countless theories about the origins of Tiwanaku. Not modern archaeological investigation has revealed that Tiwanaku was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a broader pattern of complex societies that developed throughout the Andes during the first millennium CE. The Mocha, Nazca, and Wari civilizations all achieved similar levels of sophistication during roughly the same period, suggesting that favorable climatic conditions and cultural exchange facilitated a golden age of Andean civilization that lasted for several centuries. Recent research has also shown that the agricultural innovations of Tiwanaku were far more sophisticated than previously understood. The Waru system incorporated detailed knowledge of soil science, hydrology, and meteorology that allowed the Tiwanaku people to create sustainable agricultural systems, adapted to one of the world's most challenging environments. Their success in feeding a large population at high altitude represents one of humanity's most impressive achievements in agricultural adaptation. The astronomical alignments of Tiwanaku's monuments demonstrate a level of mathematical and observational precision that rivals any ancient civilization. The builders understood the movements of the sun, moon, and stars with enough accuracy to predict eclipses and seasonal changes years in advance. This knowledge was probably essential for agricultural planning in an environment where timing was critical for crop survival. Contemporary efforts to understand and preserve Tiwanaku face significant challenges. The site suffers from erosion, looting, and the effects of modern development in the surrounding area. Rising lake levels due to climate change threaten some portions of the site, while falling levels in other years expose new areas to erosion. The Bolivian government and international organizations work to protect and study the site, but the scale of the ruins and the harsh environment make conservation efforts extremely difficult. The legacy of Tiwanaku extends beyond its impressive monuments to include innovations in agriculture, astronomy, and social organization that influenced Andean civilizations for centuries after its decline. The Waru agricultural system is being studied by modern researchers seeking sustainable farming methods for high-altitude regions. The astronomical knowledge preserved in Tiwanaku's monuments continues to inform our understanding of science and mathematics. Perhaps most importantly, Tiwanaku represents human adaptability and ingenuity in the face of environmental challenges. The civilization that created these monuments did so in one of the world's most difficult environments, at altitudes where the thin air makes physical labor exhausting and where frost can occur any day of the year. Their success demonstrates that human societies can thrive even in seemingly impossible conditions when they develop appropriate technologies and social systems. As the wind sweeps across the abandoned terraces of Tiwanaku, carrying whispers of ceremonies long forgotten, it becomes clear that these great civilizations have not truly vanished. They live on in ways both subtle and profound, their innovations, their wisdom, and their dreams woven into the fabric of human experience, like golden threads in a tapestry. Too vast for any single observer to comprehend in its entirety, the mathematical precision of the Harappan street grids echoes in modern urban planning. their understanding of drainage and sanitation providing lessons that contemporary cities struggle to implement. The bronze working techniques perfected in Mesopotamian workshops laid the foundation for metallurgy that would eventually give birth to the Industrial Revolution. The astronomical observations recorded at Stonehenge and Tiwanaku contributed to humanity's growing understanding of cosmic cycles that still guide agricultural planning and religious observances across the globe. In the markets of modern Crete, elderly women still weave patterns that can be traced back to Minoan designs, preserved in frescoes at Knossos, their fingers following rhythms established 4,000 years ago. The purple dye that made Phoenician merchants wealthy may no longer be extracted from murex shells, but the trading networks they established became the commercial arteries that connected ancient civilizations and laid the groundwork for modern, global commerce. The agricultural innovations of these forgotten peoples continue to feed the world. The terraced farming systems of Great Zimbabwe influenced agricultural development throughout southern Africa, while the raised field techniques of Tiwanaku are being rediscovered by modern farmers seeking sustainable methods for high-altitude cultivation. The crop varieties domesticated by ancient Mesoamerican civilizations corn, beans, squash, tomatoes, peppers became staples that transformed cuisines and supported population growth across the globe. Language itself carries the DNA of these vanished civilizations. The Phoenician alphabet became the ancestor of virtually every writing system used in the Western world today. Latin terms derived from Etruscan words continue to shape legal and political vocabularies. The astronomical knowledge preserved in Mayan codices influenced calendar systems that governed the rhythm of daily life for millions of people across Mesoamerica and beyond. But perhaps the most profound legacy of these civilizations lies not in their tangible contributions, but in the dreams they dared to dream and the questions they dared to ask. The builders of the Moai on Easter Island gazed inland toward an unknown future, their stone faces embodying humanity's eternal hope that something of our presence here will endure beyond the brief span of individual lives. The astronomers of Nabatea and Angkor reached toward the stars, seeking to understand humanity's place within the vast cosmos that surrounded their small worlds. These civilizations remind us that human societies have always been capable of extraordinary achievements when they combine technical innovation with shared vision. The massive stones of Baalbek and Sacsayhuaman required not just engineering skill but social cooperation on a scale that demanded trust, communication, and common purpose. The trade networks that connected ancient cities across continents required legal systems, standardized weights and measures, and diplomatic protocols that facilitated peaceful exchange across cultural boundaries. They also remind us of the fragility of even the most sophisticated societies. Climate change, resource depletion, social conflict, and contact with other civilizations could destabilize seemingly permanent institutions and force rapid adaptations that were not always successful. The abandoned cities scattered across the globe stand as monuments to human ambition, but also as warnings about the consequences of overextending resources or failing to adapt to changing circumstances. Modern archaeology continues to reveal new aspects of these civilizations, using technologies that their builders could never have imagined. Satellite imagery reveals the extent of ancient urban areas hidden beneath jungle canopy. Ground-penetrating radar maps the foundations of buildings that have been reduced to mere mounds. DNA analysis traces the movements of ancient peoples across continents and through centuries. Isotope studies of human remains reveal details about diet, health, and lifestyle that illuminate the daily experiences of people whose names have been lost to history. Each new discovery adds complexity to our understanding of the past, revealing that these civilizations were more sophisticated, more extensive, and more interconnected than previous generations of scholars had realized. The traditional narrative of human progress as a steady climb from primitive beginnings to modern sophistication is being replaced by a more nuanced understanding of rise and decline, innovation and loss, adaptation and transformation. The artistic achievements of these civilizations continue to inspire contemporary creators. The flowing lines of Minoan pottery influence modern ceramic artists. The monumental scale of Easter Island sculpture challenges contemporary sculptors to think beyond conventional limitations. The intricate textiles of ancient Peru provide patterns and techniques that contemporary weavers adapt for modern purposes. The architectural innovations of the Nabateans inspire contemporary architects, designing buildings for harsh environments. Religious and philosophical ideas that emerged in these ancient centers continue to influence spiritual practices around the world. The concept of divine kingship, developed in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, shaped political theories that persist in modern democracies and monarchies. The astronomical religions of Mesoamerica and the Andes contributed to understanding of cosmic cycles that inform contemporary environmental movements and spiritual practices. The medical knowledge accumulated by ancient civilizations laid foundations for practices that remain relevant today. Traditional healing methods preserved by indigenous peoples often incorporate plant medicines and therapeutic techniques that were first developed by their ancient predecessors. Modern pharmaceutical research continues to investigate compounds derived from plants that were first used medicinally by these forgotten peoples. Environmental management techniques developed by ancient civilizations offer valuable lessons for contemporary conservation efforts. The agroforestry systems of the Maya, the water management techniques of the Harappans, and the sustainable fishing practices of Polynesian islanders provide models for modern efforts to balance human needs with environmental protection. The social innovations of these civilizations also continue to influence contemporary societies. The legal codes developed in ancient Mesopotamia established principles of justice that still inform legal systems today. The democratic experiments of ancient Greece drew inspiration from earlier traditions of collective decision-making that existed in many ancient societies. The diplomatic protocols that facilitated trade and prevented conflicts between ancient city-states provided models for international relations that remain relevant in the modern world. Perhaps most importantly, these civilizations demonstrate the incredible diversity of human cultural expression. Each developed unique solutions to universal challenges like food production, social organization, spiritual practice, and artistic expression. Their variety reminds us that there are many different ways to organize human societies, and that the path taken by modern Western civilization is just one among many possible approaches to creating complex, sophisticated cultures. The study of these civilizations also reveals patterns that transcend specific times and places. The tendency for societies to become more complex over time, the importance of trade and communication in facilitating cultural development, the role of environmental factors in shaping social institutions, and the ways that technological innovations spread across cultural boundaries are all themes that appear repeatedly in the archaeological record at the same time. Each civilization was unique, shaped by specific geographic conditions, historical circumstances, and cultural choices that gave it a distinctive character. The isolation of Easter Island produced a society unlike any other on Earth, while the crossroads location of ancient Mesopotamia created a cosmopolitan culture that drew influences from across the known world. As we face contemporary challenges like climate change, resource depletion, and social inequality, the experiences of these ancient civilizations offer both inspiration and warning. They show us that human societies are capable of remarkable adaptability and innovation when confronted with existential challenges. They also remind us that even the most sophisticated civilizations can fail if they do not respond appropriately to changing conditions. The digital age has created new opportunities for understanding and preserving the legacy of these civilizations. Virtual reality reconstructions allow people to walk through ancient cities as they might have appeared at their peak. Digital archives preserve fragile texts and artifacts for future study. Online databases make it possible for scholars around the world to collaborate on research projects that would have been impossible just a generation ago. Indigenous communities around the world continue to maintain connections to these ancient civilizations through oral traditions, ceremonial practices, and traditional knowledge systems that have been passed down through countless generations. Their perspectives offer invaluable insights into the meanings and purposes of archaeological remains that might otherwise remain mysterious to outside observers. The globalization of the modern world has created new opportunities for cultural exchange and collaboration, but it has also threatened the survival of traditional knowledge systems and cultural practices that connect contemporary peoples to their ancient ancestors. Efforts to preserve and revitalize these connections represent an important form of cultural conservation that parallels the ethical preservation of archaeological sites. Educational initiatives that teach young people about these ancient civilizations help ensure that their lessons and inspirations will continue to influence future generations. Museum exhibitions, documentary films, and digital media presentations make the achievements of these civilizations accessible to millions of people who might never have the opportunity to visit archaeological sites in person. Tourism to archaeological sites provides economic incentives for preservation, while also creating challenges related to site protection and cultural sensitivity. The need to balance public access with conservation requirements has led to innovative approaches like replica sites, virtual tours, and carefully managed visitor programs that allow people to experience these places while minimizing damage to fragile remains. As night falls over the ruins of these great civilizations, as stars emerge in the same patterns that ancient astronomers once studied, as wind continues to erode stone monuments and desert sands shift to reveal new treasures, the story of these forgotten peoples continues to unfold. Each season brings new discoveries, new interpretations, new connections between past and present that enrich our understanding of what it means to be human. The voices of these ancient peoples speak to us across the centuries, not in words we can always understand, but in the universal language of human aspiration. They remind us that we are part of a story much larger than our individual lives. A story that began with the first humans who looked at the world around them and dared to imagine something better. They challenge us to create legacies worthy of the dreams that inspired the builders of pyramids and temples, the carvers of Moai, and the astronomers who mapped the movements of stars. In the end, these civilizations are not truly forgotten as long as we continue to learn from their achievements and remember their dreams. They live on in every carefully planned city, in every work of art that reaches toward the eternal, in every moment when human beings choose cooperation over conflict and creation over destruction. They live on in the questions we ask about our place in the universe and in our determination to leave the world a little better than we found it. The circle of time turns, seasons change, empires rise and fall, but the human spirit that created Angkor, Wat, and Machu Picchu, that carved the Moai and built the pyramids, that mapped the stars and tamed the rivers, continues to burn bright. In laboratories and artist studios, in classrooms and gardens, in the dreams of children who look up at the night sky and wonder what lies beyond the visible horizon. The legacy of these forgotten civilizations continues to inspire new chapters in the ongoing story of human possibility, and so we drift towards sleep, carried on the wind that has blown across all these ancient places, that has witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, that carries within it the dust of Babylon, and the salt spray of Phoenician harbors, the incense of Angkor's temples, and the volcanic ash of Easter Island's quarries. In sleep, perhaps, we join the dreams of all those who came before us, adding our own hopes to the great tapestry of human imagination that stretches from the first agricultural villages to the cities of tomorrow, from the earliest cave paintings to the digital archives of today, from the moment our ancestors first looked up at the stars to the endless future that awaits among those same eternal lights. Thank you for this journey through time. If these echoes of forgotten civilizations have stirred something within you, if you've found peace in these ancient stories, or if you've discovered new worlds in the whispers of the past, please take a moment to share this journey with others who might benefit from these gentle voyages through history. Like this video, if it helped you find peaceful sleep, subscribe to Fall Asleep to History for more journeys through time. Tell us in the comments which ancient civilization called to you most deeply. Share with someone who loves history, needs peaceful sleep, or enjoys learning through dreams. In every end, there is a beginning. In every forgotten civilization, there are lessons that echo through time, waiting to inspire the civilizations yet to come. Until our next journey through history, may your dreams be filled with the wisdom of ages and the peace of starlit ruins where time stands still.